What if the collapse of empires wasn't written in blood, but in brandy? From golden thrones to grimy goblets, these 30 royals didn't just rule kingdoms, they drowned in them. Vodka in Russia, sake in Japan, palm wine in Africa. History's most powerful people were often just elegantly dressed alcoholics spiraling behind palace walls. This isn't a story of glory. It's a slow pour of delusion, decadence, and denial. Welcome to 30 Royals Who Were Drive Unk All the Time, a cautionary tale soaked in liquor and sealed with a royal seal. Glass raised. Curtain up. Let the unraveling begin. Before we dive in, if dark royal history and unsettling bedtime tales are your thing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It keeps the goblets full and the ghosts talking. And while you're at it, drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Are you watching this at 2 a.m. like a true insomniac historian? Or mid-commute, pretending you're not spiraling with these monarchs? We want to know. Peter the Great, Russia. There are hangovers, and then there's Peter the Great. It wasn't that he drank. It was that he drank as if the state of Russia itself depended on it, and in his mind, it kind of did. He wasn't merely a Tsar. He was the bartender of the empire, the host of a never-ending vodka-fueled seance with history. Reforming the state? Sure. Reforming your liver? Good luck. Peter didn't sip. He summoned. Bottles weren't opened. They were slaughtered. Courtiers weren't guests. They were collateral. Diplomats came for treaties and left with cirrhosis. And the Russian Orthodox Church? Reduced to a punchline in his personal drinking club, which he titled with all the subtlety of a man blacked out on plum brandy, the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. It was less a satire of religion and more a government-funded bender with sacramental overtones. The official dress code included fake beards, ceremonial goblets, and absolutely no dignity. Members of the synod were often required to drink until they physically could not stand. One unlucky man, a courtier named Zotov, was made Prince Pope of the Synod, crowned in a mock ceremony involving animal bones and enough vodka to power a small locomotive. Peter once held a multi-day wedding for Zotov against his will, just to keep the party going. Most of the guests vomited somewhere around day 3. Zotov was married for the rest of his life. No one remembered the bride's name. Peter considered this diplomacy, or therapy, or possibly both. But beneath the drinking games and comedic blasphemy was something far more calculated. Peter weaponized intoxication the way modern leaders weaponize ambiguity. If you were passed out under the banquet table, you couldn't plot against him. If you were slurring your loyalty through a waterfall of grain alcohol, you were too compromised to be disloyal. He created a royal culture in which sobriety was suspicious and drunkenness meant trust. He wasn't exactly subtle about it. During official meetings, Peter was known to pour vodka into goblets the size of helmets. He once made a visiting Persian ambassador drink 15 consecutive shots while a choir of drunken nobles howled patriotic hymns. The ambassador vomited in a corner. Peter clapped. Treaties were signed. But this wasn't just statecraft, it was personal. Peter had inherited a fractured Russia, vast, slow, and deeply paranoid. He traveled Europe, learning shipbuilding and modern science, and returned home determined to drag Russia, sometimes literally, into the modern age. But the change he demanded came with a price. His people hated it, his court resisted, and his own son plotted against him. So Peter drank, and made them drink too. His drinking binges often lasted for days, especially during the winter months when war and frostbite took turns tormenting the Russian soul. At one point, he took a break from waging war against Sweden just to host a 10-day New Year's celebration involving costumed dwarves, sled races, and spontaneous baptisms in frozen rivers. At least 3 ambassadors had to be carried out on sleds. One reportedly hallucinated for a week. Peter, however, never seemed to get hangovers. Or if he did, he simply buried them under more vodka. The darker irony? For all his chaos, Peter did modernize Russia. He reformed the military, built a navy, founded the city of St. Petersburg, and introduced secular education. He forced boyars to shave their beards and wear Western clothes, not because he loved fashion, but because he hated medievalism. He was ruthless, progressive, deeply violent, and perpetually intoxicated. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but too poetic to ignore, that Peter once ordered a man to drink himself to death as punishment for failing to keep up with the synod. When the man died, Peter toasted to him with a smile and said, "At least he was loyal." And maybe that's the clearest window into the man himself, a Tsar who reformed an empire but couldn't reform his own need to blur it all away. He conquered sobriety the same way he conquered land, by beating it into submission. When he finally collapsed in 1725, bloated, burned out, and possibly still half drunk, no one was surprised. He had outdrunk his enemies, outdrunk his allies, outdrunk history. But Peter's drinking club didn't die with him. The all-drunken synod lasted well into the 18th century, a ghost party, staggering through the halls of power long after its host was gone. And yet, for all his drunken spectacle, Peter the Great was at least functional. Which brings us to another royal who drank as if he were born with a gold-plated liver, but preferred his drunkenness with a side of velvet, scandal, and petty gossip columns. And trust us, his name was Edward. King Edward VII, United Kingdom. Edward VII was the kind of royal who made vice look like a full-time job. He didn't just indulge in alcohol. He dressed it up in silk, poured it into baccarat crystal, and gave it a monogrammed carriage to ride in. While Peter the Great drank to reform an empire, Edward drank to avoid ever thinking about one. Born into the long, judging shadow of Queen Victoria, a woman who considered joy itself a dangerous foreign influence, young Edward grew up in a palace full of rules, silence, and sour faces. His mother disapproved of nearly everything he did, especially his appetite for pleasure. So, naturally, Edward became a man who spent his entire life in pursuit of precisely that. Food, drink, women, parties, more food, and stronger drink, not necessarily in that order. He wasn't a king during his wildest years, which probably saved the British Empire from a very flamboyant collapse. But as the Prince of Wales, he turned being a royal into a kind of professional hedonism. In an era where public restraint was a virtue, Edward VII was built like a warning label and drank like one too. His drink of choice? All of them. Champagne, cognac, port, absinthe, sherry, brandy, preferably all at the same dinner, in separate glasses, with appropriate cutlery and minor royalty seated nearby. He had a signature cocktail, the Edward VII, consisting of equal parts brandy and oblivion. Not officially, of course, but unofficially it involved a tumbler full of brandy mixed with a little curacao and a slow descent into scandal. Edward's favourite drinking establishments were private clubs, glittering palaces, and sometimes the back rooms of brothels masquerading as salons. He once remarked that a good dinner should last 3 hours and require a footman for every limb. And the women? They often matched the liquor. Expensive, intoxicating, and rarely remembered in the morning. His long-standing affair with actress Lily Langtry was an open secret. Later mistresses included Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, and Alice Keppel, who was so prominent in his life that palace staff reportedly poured her drinks before his. Edward would often arrive at events hours late, slightly flushed, a cigar already half finished, muttering something about needing a real drink before all this ceremony. His tolerance was legendary. His temper, less so. By the 1892nd, it was said that he couldn't start the day without a stiff brandy and couldn't end it without a magnum of Moet. But his indulgence wasn't all fun and flirtation. There was a rot beneath the velvet. Edward drank not just because he liked it, but because it insulated him from the pressures of expectation, from the weight of a monarchy that never truly wanted him, from a mother who reigned for so long she nearly ruled him into old age. He didn't become king until he was nearly 60. By then, the drinking wasn't just recreation, it was routine. His health was deteriorating. His waistline had long since given up. His liver probably filed for asylum. But he wore his excess like a fashion statement, tailored, perfumed, and unconcerned. Even as king, his drinking remained central. State dinners were organized around his preferences. Ambassadors were quietly briefed. Don't challenge him to a toast unless you've updated your will. He had custom-built furniture that accommodated both his girth and his cocktail requirements. His favorite phrase during long meetings was, reportedly, "Where's the port?" But here's the strange thing. People liked him, despite the debauchery, despite the slurring, despite the affairs, the gout, the bloated cheeks, the open disdain for restraint. Edward VII was popular. His charm had teeth, and he used them well. He was diplomatic when it mattered, pleasant when he had to be, and when the occasion demanded it, he could out-toast any crown on the continent. He modernized the monarchy's image not by tightening it, but by loosening it. He made royalty feel human again, flawed and indulgent, and maybe a little too fond of the good life. For a country crawling out from under the Victorian death grip, Edward was the hangover they didn't know they needed. Still, the bill always comes due. His health collapsed slowly, then all at once. Heart trouble, kidney issues, strokes. He once suffered a mild seizure at dinner and insisted on finishing the port before seeking medical attention. A few years later, in 1910, he died in bed after a final series of strokes, reportedly asking for one last cigar and a glass of wine. His final words? Not the stuff of legend. But then again, they rarely are when you've spent your life drowning legend in liquor. Edward VII left behind a monarchy more likable, more casual, and significantly more bloated. His son George V would try to clean things up, introduce a bit more discipline, fewer mistresses, less booze, less scandal. But across the world, in a different palace, under a different flag, another emperor was already embracing the opposite strategy. Drink more, isolate harder, and forget that you rule a crumbling empire. His name was Jia Jing, and he preferred his wine with a side of immortality. If you've made it this far, you're clearly one of us, someone who finds royal meltdowns and historical hangovers oddly comforting. So why not subscribe and stay tangled in the mess with us? And hey, while you're here, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you deep in a late-night rabbit hole, or casually sipping coffee while a Tsar drinks himself into oblivion? Let us know in the comments. Emperor Jia Jing Ming China. If Peter the Great drank to conquer and Edward VII drank to forget, then Emperor Jia Jing drank to disappear. Not from his empire, exactly, he still ruled it, in the most technical sense, but from its responsibilities, its people, and most of all, from reality itself. Jia Jing didn't throw wild banquets. He didn't stagger through court, drunk on wine and bravado. He didn't hold goblets up to toast his enemies or challenge foreign dignitaries to drinking games. No, Jiajing preferred the quiet intoxication of isolation. His drinking was a ritual, a slow dissolve into alchemical fantasies, Taoist illusions, and the soft, slippery bliss of denial. He ruled China during the 16th century, a time when the Ming dynasty was still powerful, but no longer invincible. Foreign threats loomed, the bureaucracy was bloated, and corruption ran like sewage beneath the gleaming surface of court ritual. And somewhere deep inside the Forbidden City, Emperor Jiajing simply opted out. He withdrew from court life almost entirely, refused to meet with ministers, ignored memorials, let petitions pile up like autumn leaves. Days passed, then weeks, then years. He built palaces within palaces, layers of chambers and gardens and ceremonial halls designed not to impress his subjects, but to keep them at bay. His favorite project? A massive, secluded Taoist retreat, complete with its own brewery. He didn't want to govern China. He wanted to live forever, preferably with a warm cup of spiced rice wine and no interruptions. And yes, there was always wine. Not vodka, not brandy, not beer. Wine. Rice wine, steeped in herbs and mystery, believed to extend life and quiet the mind. He drank it like medicine, only more enthusiastically. Some accounts suggest he drank every day, often starting early and continuing until sleep or something close to it arrived. But what's important isn't just that he drank, it's why. Jiajing was obsessed with Taoist immortality practices. He believed that if he followed the right rituals, consumed the right elixirs, and avoided the contaminations of courtly life, he could transcend death. Alcohol, in his worldview, wasn't a vice. It was a spiritual lubricant, a sacred fog through which the celestial gates might eventually open. Spoiler, they didn't. Court officials tried to reach him. They wrote increasingly desperate memorials. They begged him to appear in public, to issue decrees, to stop spending imperial funds on yet another tower dedicated to the Northern Star deity. His response? Nothing. Or worse, cryptic directives delivered by eunuchs, couched in mystical allegories and sealed with the imperial wine stamp. It wasn't just neglect. It was a kind of passive-aggressive apocalypse. The state continued to function barely through the efforts of bureaucrats who hadn't seen their emperor in years. Ministers fought proxy wars through palace servants. Factions rose and fell in the dark, all while Jiajing sipped wine in embroidered robes, contemplating his own divinity. Ironically, for a man so obsessed with eternal life, his health declined rapidly. His drinking, combined with his bizarre diet of supposed elixirs and mineral concoctions, left him frail and erratic. His sleep was irregular, his digestion worse. He reportedly believed that avoiding sexual contact and bathing in rare ingredients would preserve his spiritual energy. The wine, however, never stopped. One year, during a rare meeting with court officials, he appeared gaunt, trembling, and visibly intoxicated. He spoke in riddles, laughed at things no one understood, then disappeared for another month. The empire limped along, and so did he. His rule lasted 45 years, an impressive number if you measure reigns by duration alone, less impressive if you measure by leadership. Jiajing never led. He floated, drifted, vanished into corridors of incense and intoxication. He issued fewer edicts than almost any emperor in the Ming dynasty. He gave fewer audiences, listened to fewer voices. By the end, it was unclear whether he ruled anything at all, or whether the wine, the walls, and the rituals had simply absorbed him. When he died in 1567, there was no great national mourning, no cathartic reckoning. Just a quiet shuffling of ministers trying to restore order and sweep up the broken pieces of an administration that had operated for decades without a functioning head. His tomb was elaborate, yes, but the man buried inside it remained a mystery, even to those who'd once served him. In the end, Emperor Jiajing didn't become immortal. He became a cautionary tale. A sovereign who mistook escape for enlightenment and forgot that you cannot govern an empire from behind a wine cup no matter how spiritual the vintage. And yet, his story isn't entirely unique, because while Jiajing tried to disappear into intoxicated ritual, another royal on another continent chose the opposite tactic, to embrace indulgence as spectacle, to make decadence public, to drink not in secret, but in neon. And in the glow of Cairo's nightclubs and palace chandeliers, King Farouk of Egypt was just getting started. King Farouk, Egypt. It takes a certain type of monarch to party while his kingdom falls apart in slow motion. King Farouk, I wasn't just that type, he turned it into a personal philosophy. To him, the collapse of empire was a kind of background music, best accompanied by foie gras, imported whiskey, and late-night roulette. Where others saw responsibility, he saw an open bar. Born in 1920 into Egypt's royal family, a dynasty propped up by British imperial favour and an ever-thinner sense of national sovereignty, Farouk was raised between cultures, expectations, and egos. He inherited the throne at just 16, following the sudden death of his father, King Fuad I. Almost immediately, the country looked at him with hope. Here was a young, Western-educated king who spoke multiple languages and had all the promise of a modern ruler. Unfortunately, Farouk also had a yacht, a gambling problem, and a growing taste for anything that dulled the pressure of being monarch to a restless, colonized population. In his early years, the signs were subtle. Lavish dinners, the occasional champagne toast that lingered a little too long. Nothing shocking for royalty. But as he settled into power, or more accurately, floated above it, Farouk's indulgences grew bolder. Alcohol, while technically discouraged in Islamic Egypt, became his constant companion. His palace cellars were stocked like a European casino. French cognac, British gin. Scotch aged longer than most of his policies lasted. And it wasn't just about quantity, it was ritual. He drank to unwind, he drank to avoid, he drank because the press hounded him, the British undermined him, and the people criticized him, and most of all, because no one could stop him. He was, after all, the king. Cairo in the 1942nd was a city balanced between elegance and entropy. The war years had brought Allied soldiers, foreign spies, and black market fortunes. Farouk fit into this strange mix perfectly. He was often seen driving his luxury cars at night, reportedly drunk, with friends and hangers-on in tow. He'd park in front of nightclubs, stroll in without warning, and order drinks like a man who believed time and history would wait for him to sober up. He once declared that he wanted to own the world's largest collection of everything. This included not just coins, watches, and stamps, but also wine, whiskey, and champagne. Rare vintages disappeared into his personal vaults, rarely consumed and often forgotten, like neglected treaties. His drinking wasn't just private, it bled into his politics. Cabinet meetings were delayed or missed. Important guests were sometimes made to wait while he nursed a hangover or entertained himself elsewhere. Intelligence reports from the British noted his erratic behaviour, including nights of excess that ended with him raging at servants or falling asleep during briefings. He was no longer a symbol of Egypt's future. He was a punchline with a crown. And the people noticed. As the monarchy's credibility eroded, Farouk leaned in harder, not into reform, but into escapism. Lavish banquets were thrown even as Egypt's economy struggled. Imported liquors were consumed while soldiers went unpaid. He once sent an emissary to Europe with a shopping list that included rare wines, expensive perfumes, and luxury cigars, all during a national food shortage. He even had a peculiar superstition. He feared the number 13 and refused to have any items in sets of that number. And yet, no amount of magical thinking could prevent what was coming. Egypt was growing tired not just of monarchy, but of this monarchy. Of a king who governed like a spoiled guest, overstaying his welcome. The final blow came in 1952 with the Free Officers Movement. Led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the military coup was swift and mostly bloodless. Farouk was forced to abdicate and was allowed to flee not as a monarch but as an exile. He took with him several suitcases, a dwindling fortune, and, of course, his collection of rare liquors. In exile in Italy, Farouk's drinking only worsened. His once glamorous life narrowed into a series of overstuffed meals and evening benders. He ballooned in weight, rarely appeared in public sober, and gave interviews that felt like blurry echoes of his former charisma. One observer noted that the ex-king would start lunch with wine, follow it with whiskey, and end it with silence. He died in 1965 at the age of 45, collapsing at a restaurant table after a meal described as excessive, even by his standards. No one knows exactly what caused his death: heart failure, stroke, or just the slow, cumulative toll of a lifetime spent treating his body like an amusement park. And yet, like so many royals on this list, Farouk's story doesn't end in clean condemnation. He was, in some ways, a mirror of the world he ruled, conflicted, insecure, desperate to seem modern, while unable to let go of the past. His drinking wasn't the cause of Egypt's decline, but it was its clearest metaphor, a ruler numbing himself while the walls crumbled around him. Still, even Farouk never made major policy decisions while drunk in bed, surrounded by goblets and state documents. For that, we have to look east again, to Poland, and to a king who took alcohol to bed like it was part of his royal regalia, a man named Władysław IV Wasa. King Władysław IV. Wasa, Poland. Some monarchs drink to forget, some drink to escape. Władysław IV Wasa of Poland, however, drank like it was his civic duty, as if the weight of the Commonwealth could only be lifted with the help of a ceremonial goblet and a few barrels of Hungarian wine. And for reasons known only to him, and perhaps the bottom of his cup, he liked to take that wine with him to bed. Not metaphorically, literally. By the 17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was an unwieldy behemoth, vast, powerful on paper, but increasingly fragile in practice. It was a state held together by a noble class allergic to compromise, a king whose authority was strictly limited, and a system of government that was essentially a very loud argument held in Latin. Into this walked Władysław IV, princely, educated, ambitious, and, unfortunately, deeply fond of alcohol. Władysław was the son of Sigismund III Vasa, a deeply devout and austere man who had once been king of both Sweden and Poland before losing the Swedish crown in a series of unfortunate Protestant Catholic misunderstandings, gunpowder, and dynastic arrogance. Władysław inherited only Poland and seemingly none of his father's restraint. To be fair, Władysław wasn't a complete disaster. He was an able diplomat, well-traveled, and spoke multiple languages. He played the lute, he read theology, he commissioned art, but he also drank with the enthusiasm of someone trying to personally prop up the wine industry in Central Europe. Accounts from his reign note that royal banquets were less dinner and more ritualized collapse. They lasted for hours, sometimes days, With food served in excess and drink flowing without interruption, Władysław could reportedly hold his liquor better than most, but not always with the precision one might hope for in a head of state. He was known to make major policy decisions about war, alliances, noble privileges, while in a state of alcohol-assisted enthusiasm. Sometimes these decisions stuck. Sometimes they vanished into the haze, remembered only by the unfortunate secretary who wrote them down. But what truly stood out, even among his indulgences, was his strange bedtime habit. Władysław did not like to be without drink, even in sleep. Every night, it said, a servant would prepare a small table near his bedside. On it, a candle, a dagger, and a flagon of wine. Sometimes two. On colder nights, he would sip from the cup before lying down, as if warding off dreams with fermented courage. On worse nights, he would sit up in bed, drinking slowly in silence, contemplating the failing alliances of Europe, or the last insult from a stubborn Lithuanian noble. Insomnia, it seems, was no match for alcohol. His relationship with drink bled into his politics. He tried, often in vain, to strengthen the monarchy, to centralize power, to push Poland into a more modern age. But every attempt was blocked by the szlachta, the nobility, who enjoyed their own privileges far too much to let a king start acting like a king. So Władysław drank, not just out of habit, but out of helplessness. He was a monarch in a gilded cage, respected, honored, but largely powerless. Alcohol became both an escape and a protest. If he couldn't rule decisively, at least he could toast defiantly. Despite this, he managed a few accomplishments. He supported science and the arts, brought Italian opera to Warsaw, and even tried to mediate peace during the 30 Years' War. But these victories were always tempered by his erratic behavior, frequent illnesses, and the creeping suspicion among the nobility that their king was more committed to his wine cellar than to the throne. His court was known for its extravagance, but also for its unpredictability. A formal meeting could turn into a feast without warning. A diplomatic mission could end with a drinking contest. Some foreign envoys found it charming. Others found it deeply alarming. He died in 1648 at the age of 52, reportedly after a brief illness, though some whispered that his body had simply grown tired of keeping up with his habits. His reign was mourned, but not revered. He had tried to be more than a figurehead, and had failed, not entirely through his own fault, but the image that lingered was not of a failed reformer or tragic monarch. It was of a man, alone in bed, sipping wine by candlelight, trying to stay awake long enough to make the crown mean something. And yet, Władysław's drunken melancholy seems almost quaint compared to the chaos that would erupt in the Ottoman Empire not long after. Because, in Istanbul, another ruler was drinking. But where Władysław was poetic, Sultan Ibrahim I was pure paranoia, and his wine glass came with a side of madness. Sultan Ibrahim, Ottoman Empire. In the long, dramatic opera of Ottoman sultans, a lineup featuring geniuses, conquerors, poets, maniacs, and sometimes all four at once, Sultan Ibrahim I stands out for managing to do almost nothing productively except spiral. His reign was short, his achievements were minimal, and his state of mind was fluid, much like his goblet. Nicknamed Ibrahim the Mad, a branding decision that does little to flatter either the man or the period that tolerated him, he took the throne in 1640 after spending most of his life imprisoned in the infamous cafes, the royal cage where potential heirs were kept under house arrest to prevent inconvenient coups. Imagine being locked away for decades, uncertain whether your next meal would be your last, then suddenly being handed absolute power and a fully stocked imperial liquor cabinet. It did not go well. When Ibrahim became sultan, the empire was technically stable, but only in the way a dam is stable when the cracks are hairline and the water is patient. His brother Murad IV, a brutal authoritarian who famously banned alcohol and executed offenders, had just died, and the court, desperate for calm, installed Ibrahim as a kind of placeholder king. He was supposed to be controllable, predictable, quiet. Instead, they got a man who, upon being told his brother had died, refused to believe it until they showed him the corpse. Even then, he reportedly poked the body to make sure it wasn't a trick. Once convinced, he wept, muttered something about divine fate, and promptly had his first drink, the first of many. Ibrahim had no real experience with politics, or war, or basic governance, but he had developed an excellent relationship with distraction. His days quickly filled with rituals, indulgences, and paranoid episodes, and hovering over all of it, the haze of alcohol. Ottoman sources rarely detailed the consumption habits of sultans. Discretion was expected, even when the reality was anything but. But, with Ibrahim, the rumors escaped the palace walls like steam from a cracked bathhouse. Reports from the time describe excessive banquets, endless feasts, and nights that ended with incoherent ramblings and suspicious decrees signed in shaky handwriting. While the ulema, religious scholars, disapproved, the court mostly looked the other way. Better an inebriated sultan than an unpredictable one. Though with Ibrahim, they didn't get to choose, he was both. He would disappear into his private quarters for days, drinking and brooding, surrounded by advisors too afraid to contradict him and servants too exhausted to keep up. And when he emerged, the policies were either laughably impractical or terrifyingly unhinged. One day, he might distribute lavish gifts to random citizens. The next, he might order executions based on rumors whispered during a dinner party. His paranoia deepened with every passing month, and alcohol only magnified it. He began to suspect treason in every shadow, every council meeting, every silence. Ministers were dismissed for looking the wrong way. Edicts were scrawled late at night, under the influence of either drink, fear, or both. There's a particularly grim moment when Ibrahim, convinced that his enemies were plotting within the palace, allegedly began making erratic security decisions while visibly drunk. He ordered guards to patrol corridors no one used, doubled protection on rooms he never entered, and once had a section of the harem temporarily sealed off because he believed the walls were whispering. Not metaphorically, actually whispering. The empire, meanwhile, drifted. Military campaigns stalled, finances crumbled, corruption spread like ivy through the bureaucracy. Ibrahim's advisors, especially his mother, Kösem Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, tried to stabilize the court, but even she couldn't contain his outbursts or his consumption. At one point, she reportedly removed all alcohol from his private chambers in an effort to curb his spirals. Within 2 days, it was back smuggled in by servants who feared his rage more than her disapproval. By 1648, just 8 years into his rule, the situation became unbearable. The Janissaries, the elite military corps, mutinied. They were tired of chaos, tired of whispered decrees and erratic orders, tired of a sultan who, according to palace gossip, once cancelled a military campaign because his astrologer saw something wet and confusing in the stars. Ibrahim was deposed in a coup so swift and clean, it almost seemed practiced. He was taken to a quiet chamber, stripped of his authority, and replaced by his 7-year-old son, Mehmed IV, a child. Better a child than a drunk with delusions and too much time on his hands. He died shortly after. The official cause was strangulation, but unofficially, the empire sighed in relief. The drinking, the paranoia, the lost years, all of it folded into the empire's long memory, catalogued under lessons no one ever fully learns. But Ibrahim's story wasn't unique. It was just one more reminder of what happens when a crown meets a bottle. And next, we visit another Tsar who preferred vodka to virtue and who ruled not in madness, but in sheer unrelenting appetite. Alexander III of Russia. Tsar Alexander III, Russia. In a dynasty known for its extremes, Tsar Alexander III was an anchor, a slab of iron in human form, built like a bear and fond of vodka, like it was part of the national anthem. He didn't just drink, he drank in the way Russian autocrats did best. Stoically, heavily, and without ever acknowledging that anything was amiss. Alexander came to the throne in 1881 under a shadow so dark it almost swallowed him whole. His father, Alexander II, the so-called Tsar Liberator, had just been assassinated by revolutionaries, torn to pieces by bombs on the streets of St. Petersburg. The era of reform was over. The age of reaction had begun. And the man now holding the crown had no interest in progress, only control. And control, for Alexander III, meant power, pressure, and in private, a deeply personal relationship with the bottle. To the outside world, Alexander projected strength. He grew out his beard, wore military uniforms almost constantly, and walked like he could crush dissent beneath his boots. He was famously strong. Legend has it he once bent a silver fork in half out of irritation and snapped a heavy crystal goblet with one hand. These stories were repeated, embellished, and enshrined. He wanted the empire to know that its ruler was not just in charge, but physically inevitable. But behind palace walls, strength needed lubrication. Vodka was Alexander's constant companion. Not in the rowdy, theatrical manner of Peter the Great, but in a grim, steady drip. It wasn't a party. It was a coping mechanism. Every day brought new threats. Anarchists, Marxists, students with printing presses, peasants with nothing to lose. Alexander's solution was to double down on autocracy. He rolled back reforms, tightened censorship, expanded the secret police, and centralized power so heavily that ministers had to seek approval for decisions as minor as railway schedules. He ruled like a fortress. But even fortresses have cracks, and alcohol filled the ones in Alexander's soul. At dinner he drank methodically, vodka before meals, more vodka during. Sometimes wine, sometimes cognac, but always circling back to Russia's favorite firewater. He preferred traditional Russian fare, black bread, salted fish, stews, and he preferred it served with silence. Meals were tense affairs, toasts were short, but the glasses kept getting refilled. He wasn't known for slurred speeches or public debauchery. His intoxication was quieter, more introspective, a slow dissolving of tension that never quite vanished. His family, especially his wife Maria Feodorovna, often tried to soften him. She was cultured, European, and emotionally intelligent. He was large, brooding, and mostly unmoved. But he loved her, and it was perhaps in her presence that he drank least, or at least more politely. Outside the family circle, however, the vodka flowed. His drinking was an open secret among court officials and foreign diplomats. Some admired his tolerance, others feared it. Decisions made late in the evening were sometimes more emotional, more rigid, less thought through. His legendary temper flared more often when drinking, not in wild outbursts, but in cold decrees. A minister demoted, a province punished, a newspaper shuttered. And yet, it would be too simple to call him a drunk tyrant. He was also a man under crushing psychological weight. The burden of holding together a sprawling, unstable empire had driven his father to liberalize and then to ruin. Alexander believed the only path to survival was the reverse. But survival, when it depends on crushing everything around you, leaves very little room for reflection, or sleep, or trust. So he drank. Not to escape, but to endure. He famously rejected European luxuries, called Western liberalism a disease, slept on a hard iron bed, took cold baths, presented himself as a kind of divine worker king. But even that image cracked in private. There were nights when his aides reported that he would sit alone after meetings, silent, glass in hand, staring at nothing. They didn't interrupt. They just refilled the glass. He died in 1894 at the relatively young age of 49. Kidney failure, heart problems, and the slow grind of stress. The official cause of death was nephritis. The unofficial cause might as well have been being the Romanov tasked with holding back a tidal wave armed with a shot glass. His son, Nicholas II, would inherit the throne and eventually lose both it and his life. But Alexander, for all his harshness, believed he had saved Russia. That his rigidity, his drinking, his endless resistance to change had bought the empire time. Maybe it did. But it also sealed its fate. The cracks he refused to see would eventually split open under his son's weaker hand. Still, before Nicholas, before collapse, there was another royal who looked at castles and saw fairy tales, not politics. A ruler who escaped not through control or reaction, but through beauty, fantasy, and wine. His name was Ludwig II of Bavaria, and he preferred his intoxication to come with chandeliers. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, Germany. Every monarchy has its dreamers. Ludwig II of Bavaria was Germany's Cham, or more accurately, he was its haunting, beautiful, intoxicated delusion. Born in 1845 and crowned at just 18, Ludwig didn't so much rule Bavaria as drift through it. From the beginning, he was more enchanted by swans, music, and medieval romance than by ministries or budgets. He spoke rarely in council, often skipped state functions, and spent most of his reign building castles that looked like they belonged on the cover of a fantasy novel, because to Ludwig, real life was the problem. The fairy tale was the cure. And what better way to make a fairy tale feel real than by drinking until the world blurred just enough to resemble a Wagner opera? Ludwig wasn't the kind of royal who drank publicly, like Peter the Great or Edward VII. He didn't throw raucous parties or stumble down palace steps with a goblet in each hand. His drinking was more melancholic, ritualistic. He drank the way someone listens to sad music alone, not to forget the world, but to romanticize its absence. Wine was his preferred companion, red, rich, usually imported, and always decanted into fine crystal. There are records of him ordering cases of French Bordeaux, even as Bavaria's finances began to wither under the weight of his architectural obsessions. He had wine cellars beneath each of his personal residences. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Erinci am See, stocked not just with vintage bottles, but with atmosphere, gilded fixtures, candlelight, velvet furnishings. The drinking wasn't just consumption, it was part of the performance. He often dined alone, sometimes in rooms so opulent they felt like fever dreams. One famous example is the Venus Grotto at Linderhof, a man-made cave with a lake, coloured lighting, and a swan boat where Ludwig would sip wine and listen to Wagner's music in total isolation. Servants would lower food and drink into the room via hidden lifts, so he wouldn't have to see or speak to anyone. He preferred ghosts to guests. This behavior intensified as the years passed. Ludwig began staying awake through the night and sleeping during the day. He would wander his castles in elaborate medieval costumes, drink from goblets styled after 14th century designs, and stage private operas with himself as the only audience member, usually reclining on cushions, a glass of wine in hand, lost in reverie. His ministers, increasingly concerned, sent reports to Berlin. The king was spending extravagantly, ignoring constitutional limits, refusing to meet with advisors, and quietly appearing less and less sober at the few state functions he did attend. He would arrive late, eyes glassy, words slurred not dramatically, but just enough to cause unease. The drinking itself wasn't scandalous by royal standards. What unsettled the court was how he drank alone, obsessively, and as part of an ever-deepening withdrawal from the real world. Unlike other monarchs who used alcohol to fuel their public personas, Ludwig used it to vanish. Meanwhile, his castles multiplied. Neuschwanstein, perhaps the most famous, was never even finished in his lifetime. It was a fantasy fortress perched on a Bavarian hilltop, soaring towers, frescoes of knights and swans, hidden passages, and private rooms designed solely for dreaming. Beneath its elegance, however, was a sobering truth. Bavaria was broke. The state had taken out loans to cover Ludwig's spending. His refusal to engage with constitutional processes had created a power vacuum. Ministers whispered of insanity. Psychiatrists were dispatched. The rumors swelled. He was delusional, paranoid, intoxicated, and unreachable. In 1886, the crisis came to a head. A medical commission which had never actually examined him in person declared Ludwig mentally unfit to rule. He was deposed. The next day, he was placed under arrest at Kasselberg, under the supervision of Dr. Bernhard von Guden. What happened next remains one of European royalty's most enduring mysteries. Ludwig went for a walk with the doctor. Hours later, their bodies were found floating in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. No witnesses, no autopsy that satisfied the skeptics, just a dead king and a dead doctor and a nation caught between relief and regret. Officially, it was ruled a suicide and accidental drowning. Unofficially, it was a palace whisper turned deadly. Ludwig's legacy lives on, ironically, through tourism. His castles, once symbols of ruinous delusion, now bankroll Bavarian heritage. Tourists wander through Neuschwanstein, snapping photos of rooms Ludwig barely lived in, unaware that the man who built it drank alone under painted ceilings, convinced that beauty could protect him from reality. It didn't. Still, there's something haunting about the image. A solitary king, cloaked in velvet, sipping wine in a man-made cave while listening to operas no one else would hear. A man who tried to outrun history, not with armies or power, but with aesthetics and alcohol. And yet, Ludwig wasn't the only one to descend slowly into drink as his country quietly unraveled. In Denmark, another king would meet his twilight years with the same murky cocktail of nostalgia, loneliness, and too much brandy. His name was Frederick VI, and he, too, chose the bottle over the burden. King Frederick VI, Denmark. Some kings unravel in public. Others do so behind thick curtains and heavy velvet coats, with a brandy glass in one hand and a 1,000-yard stare in the other. King Frederick VI of Denmark was firmly in the second category. He didn't collapse all at once. He just faded. Slowly, silently, and always with something to drink. Born in 1768, Frederick lived through more turbulence than most European monarchs care to remember: wars, revolutions, invasions, and the slow erosion of royal power. He became regent of Denmark at the age of 16 due to his father's mental illness and was officially crowned king in 1808. That's a long time to carry the weight of a crown, a long time to keep up appearances, and an even longer time to hide the cracks forming underneath. Early in his reign, Frederick seemed like a reformer. He ended serfdom, pushed for education, advocated for certain civil liberties cautiously, of course, and mostly to avoid being overthrown like his contemporaries. But there was energy there, a sense of modernity, hope. And then, as often happens in monarchy, the weight of it all started to sink in. Denmark was a small kingdom trying to act like a big one. Caught between Napoleonic France and Imperial Britain, it was frequently punished for alliances it couldn't really control. In 1807, Copenhagen was bombarded by the British, one of the rare times a European capital was shelled without a formal declaration of war. The Danish fleet was taken. National pride was wounded. The king, still relatively young, was left scrambling for dignity in a world that increasingly treated small monarchies like punchlines. Frederick didn't lash out. He didn't scream. He just poured another drink. Brandy was his favorite, rich, warm, and slow-burning, like the memories he didn't care to relive. As the years passed, brandy became a fixture in his day, not in a scandalous, stumbling way. No public outbursts, no drunken slurs, just a quiet numbing. A little before lunch, a little more after. A steady, dignified surrender. By the 1832nd, those closest to him noticed a shift. His decision-making grew sluggish. Meetings dragged on with little resolution. He stopped reading reports thoroughly, often relying on advisors to summarize or, more dangerously, to interpret as they saw fit. Some claimed he was simply tired. Others whispered that he was frequently under the influence. Either way, the man who once spoke of progress now seemed disinterested in anything that required more than a nod. His ministers began making decisions in his name. His court became more ceremonial than political. And while the machinery of government ground on, the king's presence became increasingly ghost-like, present in body, absent in mind. He still hosted formal dinners, of course. Appearances had to be maintained, and there the brandy flowed more freely. Guests noted that the king often drank more than anyone else at the table, though he carried it well. Years of practice. At these events, he would smile politely, raise his glass, say little. Occasionally, he'd tell stories from decades prior battles, negotiations, old court scandals, but always in a detached tone, as if recounting someone else's life. The reality was simpler and sadder. Frederick had grown old in a world that no longer cared much for kings. Denmark had lost Norway in 1814. Its international influence had dwindled. Liberal movements were gaining ground, demanding constitutions and parliaments and limits on royal authority. And Frederick, once a young man of ideas, no longer had the energy or clarity to resist or adapt. In his final years, he rarely left his residence. He was often seen walking the palace gardens alone, his posture slightly slumped, occasionally stopping to speak to trees or statues, always with a glass in hand. Courtiers began scheduling meetings around his mood swings, which were often tied to how early he had begun drinking that day. Still, the country did not erupt. Denmark remained stable, not thriving, but not collapsing either. Frederick's slow withdrawal was cushioned by the bureaucracy he had once helped modernize. The system worked just well enough to make his decline look like a constitutional quirk rather than a leadership vacuum. When he died in 1839, at the age of 70, the obituary writers were gentle. They called him dignified, pious, devoted to his people. They left out the brandy. They left out the long afternoons lost to foggy recollections and the quiet delegation of governance to anyone willing to do the actual work. History remembers Frederick VI as a quiet king, a stabilizer, a moderate, which, in many ways, he was. But behind that calm exterior was a man slowly drinking his way out of history. He didn't fall. He dissolved one careful glass at a time. And yet, compared to the man who followed in his footsteps, another monarch who drank heavily, ruled erratically, and surrounded himself with paranoia, Frederick looks almost serene. Because the next royal drank not to numb, but to survive his own madness. His name was Tsar Paul I, and he made instability an imperial virtue. Tsar Paul I. If Russian history is a novel, then Tsar Paul I is that one chaotic chapter no one quite knows how to interpret, full of erratic pacing, contradictory decisions, and long, unprovoked rants that seem to veer off course only to end with an exclamation mark. He was not a popular man. He was not a stable man. And he certainly was not a sober man. Paul I, the son of Catherine the Great, spent most of his life waiting to rule, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for someone, anyone, to treat him like a legitimate heir instead of a placeholder in a gilded hallway. By the time he finally ascended the throne in 1796, after his mother's death, Paul wasn't just anxious, he was brittle, paranoid. A tightly coiled spring of inherited trauma, bureaucratic resentment, and unresolved mommy issues. And in the middle of all that, vodka, a lot of it. Unlike his mother, whose drinking was refined and calculated, part politics, part pleasure, Paul's drinking was reactive. When he drank, he didn't unwind, he unraveled. But to understand his drinking, you first have to understand his reign and the fever dream that it became. From the moment Paul took power, he began reversing nearly every policy his mother had put in place. Not because they were bad policies, many weren't, but because they were hers. He hated how history had treated her as the enlightened ruler and him as the footnote. So he rewrote the rules, literally. He issued hundreds of decrees in his first year alone, micromanaging everything from military uniforms to public behavior. Officers were required to wear their uniforms in public, even on weekends. Soldiers had to shave their mustaches and walk with military posture at all times. Clerks were disciplined for handwriting that didn't meet royal standards. If he'd lived long enough, he probably would have tried to regulate breathing. All of this was enforced with increasing severity, and always under the influence of something close to obsession, and often something closer to vodka. Paul's court became a place of contradictions. Formality mixed with fear. Loyalty was rewarded, then punished. Decisions were made, reversed, then made again after dinner. He would summon ministers at odd hours, grill them with detailed questions about obscure policies, and then interrupt the conversation with toasts, sometimes to Russia, sometimes to invisible enemies. He had a small, hand-picked circle of advisors, most of whom drank because he did. Cabinet meetings were often long, meandering affairs, punctuated by raised voices and sudden changes of subject. One ambassador wrote in a private letter that meeting with the Tsar is like being trapped in a snowstorm, disorienting, endless, and you're never sure if you'll make it out. The vodka didn't cause Paul's instability, but it did lubricate it, amplify it, turn the dials all the way up. He drank to sharpen his speeches. He drank to soothe his nerves. He drank to erase what couldn't be undone, his own deep insecurity about being unloved, untrusted, and largely unfit for the role he'd finally inherited. Catherine had built an empire with poise and public charm. Paul ruled as if the walls themselves might betray him at any moment. And in time, they did. By 1801, The paranoia had reached a crescendo. Paul believed he was surrounded by traitors, which, ironically, he was. His erratic leadership, his draconian reforms, and his increasingly volatile behavior had alienated the court, the nobility, the military, and even his own sons. He changed sleeping quarters constantly, fearing assassination. He reportedly had food tasted multiple times, and his guards were rotated obsessively. And yes, the vodka was still there. By then, it was practically a sidekick. On the night of the 23rd of March, 1801, a group of disgruntled officers stormed his palace chambers. The assassination was swift, brutal. It ended a reign that had lasted barely 5 years but had felt like 5 decades. His son, Alexander I, took the throne the next morning, promising stability and reform and immediately ordering the suppression of all discussions about his father's death. Paul I was buried with full honors, but history buried him deeper under layers of embarrassment, confusion, and a sense that perhaps Russia had simply suffered a prolonged fever and then recovered. And yet, Paul left behind more than erratic laws and half-finished decrees. He left behind a warning about power wielded in isolation, about paranoia amplified by intoxication, and about what happens when a man drinks not to forget, but to protect himself from a world he no longer understands. Still, as strange as Paul was, he wasn't the only ruler to medicate his anxieties with alcohol. In Spain, another monarch, frail, inbred, and hopelessly unprepared, tried to steady his mind and body with the only tool he had left. That monarch was Charles II of Spain. And his cup, too, was never far from reach. King Charles II of Spain. If you were to take every bad decision made by a royal dynasty, bottle it, and age it in a barrel of unchecked power, the result would be King Charles II of Spain, a man who was less the product of leadership training and more the inevitable outcome of too many Habsburg cousins marrying each other. Born in 1661, Charles was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, and by the time he took the throne, the empire that once ruled half the globe was more ceremonial than sovereign. Its economy was gasping, its military stretched thin, and at the top sat a young man physically fragile, mentally overwhelmed, and quietly reaching for a drink. Charles II wasn't known for leading armies or drafting laws. He was known for being a ruler who, quite simply, was not built for ruling. His body was weak, his speech often slurred. He suffered from frequent illnesses, seizures, and debilitating headaches. His courtiers called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, partly because of superstitions, partly because they couldn't believe a man so incapacitated had made it to the throne. But underneath all of this awkward ceremony, all of this theatrical piety, was a very human coping mechanism: wine. To call Charles an alcoholic in the modern sense might be a stretch, but by the standards of his time, and certainly by the standards of his court, he drank heavily and consistently. Wine was his near-constant companion. It was served with every meal. It followed him from audience chamber to chapel. It softened the headaches, silenced the courtiers, and slowed the panic. And panic was a familiar guest in Charles's world. From a young age, he was told that he carried the hopes of an empire in decline, an empire that desperately needed a strong, healthy heir. But Charles could barely read without fatigue. He could hardly walk without assistance. Diplomats from other courts would write home with horror or pity, often both. "He is more like a ghost than a king," one wrote. Another described him as childlike in speech, old in complexion, and not entirely conscious of his surroundings. Still, he reigned. Or rather, he existed while others reigned around him. Ministers and advisors formed competing factions, each vying for control. His mother acted as regent for many years. Priests whispered in his ear about divine punishment and royal obligation. Doctors offered bizarre treatments, mercury, leeches, sacred relics, and cleansing tonics that likely included alcohol as a base ingredient. One can only imagine how many of Charles's prescriptions were just socially acceptable ways to keep him subdued. Alcohol served multiple roles in his life. It dulled the chronic pain that came from his many physical ailments. It provided brief moments of calm in a court riddled with infighting. And, more than anything, it offered an escape from the crushing awareness that he could not fulfill what everyone needed him to be. He rarely spoke at length, and when he did, it was often repetitive, confused, or unintentionally comical. Foreign ambassadors sometimes reported seeing him doze off mid-conversation, only to wake suddenly, raise a goblet of wine, and make a toast to the unity of Christendom, or some other vague ideal that no longer applied. Whether it was faith, fear, or fermented escape, Charles kept reaching for the cup. Behind the scenes, real power flowed elsewhere through his advisors, his mother, and later his wives, both of whom reportedly tried to support him but could do little to change the trajectory. Charles II was a king in name, but a patient in reality, one too heavily medicated to function, too revered to challenge, and too fragile to ignore. His reign saw Spain lose further ground in Europe. His ministers pursued policies that often contradicted each other. The economy limped along, revolts flared up in the colonies, but inside the royal palaces, Charles floated from room to room, accompanied by priests, physicians, and servants carrying trays of comfort, including the ever-present wine. Toward the end of his life, the drinking only increased. Some reports claim he began consuming alcohol not just during meals but between them, even early in the day. It wasn't a matter of celebration. It was maintenance, an act of survival. His health deteriorated further, and with it, the facade of governance that had barely held together. His court descended into paranoia, spiritual obsession, and political desperation. In 1700, Charles died without an heir, and with him died the Habsburg line in Spain. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive international conflict fueled by centuries of dynastic intermarriage, poor governance, and one man's inability to produce the future everyone expected from him. Today, Charles II is often remembered as a tragic figure, a victim of genetics and politics, more than of his own choices. But even tragedy has its rituals. And for Charles, the ritual came in a wine cup offered in silence, accepted with trembling hands, and consumed in the shadow of a crumbling empire. And yet, even Charles's quiet descent couldn't rival what came next, a monarch whose appetite for excess was neither private nor tragic, but proud, public, and utterly unrelenting. Enter King George IV of the United Kingdom, the man who mistook gluttony for greatness and gin for governance. King George IV, United Kingdom. If ever there was a monarch whose liver ought to have been included in the royal succession, it was George IV of the United Kingdom. By the time he officially became king in 1820, his internal organs were already the stuff of legend, not because of longevity, but because of what they'd survived. George didn't merely indulge, he consumed not just alcohol, but admiration, attention, sugar, silk, flattery, architecture, applause, and anything remotely resembling validation. And alcohol, that was the baseline, the warm bath in which all his other vices soaked. Long before he took the throne, George had perfected the art of being publicly dissolute. As Prince of Wales, he earned the nickname Prinny, which sounds charming until you realise it's the Regency equivalent of calling your monarch a spoiled influencer. He was extravagantly dressed, extravagantly in debt, and extravagantly drunk, usually all at once. If King Charles II of Spain drank to cope, and Tsar Paul I drank to fortify his delusions, George IV drank for sport. He was introduced to alcohol. Early port, punch, wine, and brandy were staples of the Georgian court, but George took to it with something closer to religious fervour. He reportedly began each day with a glass of fortified wine, followed it with sherry, sipped Madeira through cabinet meetings, and ended the day with brandy strong enough to disinfect battle wounds. And that was before dinner. By his 20s, he was already developing a reputation. London society whispered about his late-night rides through the city in a private coach, his stops at elite gentlemen's clubs where he could be found red-faced and laughing, drink in one hand, scandal in the other. When Parliament attempted to rein in royal spending, George simply increased his debts. At one point, he owed over £500,000, a sum so enormous it might as well have been a down payment on the moon. Much of it, unsurprisingly, went to food and drink. He ate like a king but drank like a man, trying to forget that he had no real job. Official duties bored him. Protocols annoyed him. Responsibility was something for clerks. What George wanted was attention, and alcohol gave him the courage, or at least the plausible deniability, to demand it shamelessly. As Prince Regent, he held lavish banquets at Carlton House, where tables groaned under the weight of courses that lasted until dawn. Foreign dignitaries were both appalled and impressed. The wines were exquisite. The quantity was criminal. At one banquet, it said that over 14 types of wine were served between courses. Champagne flowed like a recurring nightmare. Punch bowls were the size of bathtubs. And George? He was the sun around which this liquored-up solar system revolved. But his drinking wasn't just theatrical, it was functional. It dulled the edges of a deeply insecure personality. He lived in constant comparison to his father, George III, whose bouts of madness had at least been balanced by frugality and piety. George IV was neither frugal nor pious. He was performative, and alcohol helped maintain the performance. As he aged, the effects became impossible to ignore. He ballooned in weight, his face puffed and ruddy, his eyes watery. His health deteriorated rapidly. Gout, edema, high blood pressure, and digestive problems plagued him. His hands trembled, his legs swelled. He could barely walk without assistance. But the drinking continued. Even as his doctors begged him to reduce his intake, George insisted on wine with every meal, often multiple bottles. A physician once described his condition as a fortress under siege, and the enemy lives in the wine cellar. Even in matters of state, the alcohol made itself known. George would arrive late to meetings, sometimes visibly hungover or still reeking of brandy. He slurred his way through speeches. He forgot key details. His courtiers learned to smile politely and correct his errors in ways that wouldn't draw too much attention. And the public? They turned him into a caricature, the bloated king, draped in lace and arrogance, laughing while the kingdom tightened its belt. Yet for all his indulgence, George IV left behind a strange legacy. He was, improbably, a patron of the arts. He championed architecture, supported composers, and helped shape the face of modern London, albeit usually from the comfort of a well-upholstered chair and after 3 glasses of claret. The Brighton Pavilion, with its Indo-Saracenic domes and absurd extravagance, is the architectural equivalent of George himself, excessive, confused, but somehow still standing. He died in 1830, bloated, ill, and alone. His health had collapsed under the weight of decades of indulgence. At the end, he could barely speak. His final days were spent in near isolation, surrounded by food he couldn't eat and drink he shouldn't consume, but still did. One report noted that his last requests included, no surprise, a glass of brandy. George IV wasn't mourned so much as tolerated to the finish line. But in the centuries since, his image has calcified into something oddly instructive. The ruler who drank like a commoner, lived like a monarch, and governed like neither. Still, if George IV was gluttony personified, our next royal wore his liquor like an heirloom, quiet, measured, and wrapped in the cold air of Nordic restraint. Which brings us to King Håkon VII of Norway, a man beloved by his people, even as he quietly toasted away the years behind closed doors. King Håkon VII, Norway. If George IV drank to be seen, King Håkon VII of Norway drank not to disappear, but to endure. He was not flamboyant, not excessive, not slurring through speeches or collapsing at banquets. He was composed, regal, stoic. And yet, if you looked closely, past the medals, past the posture, past the immaculate royal etiquette, you'd often find a tumbler of whiskey quietly standing at attention beside him. Born Prince Carl of Denmark in 1872, Håkon didn't start out Norwegian. He became Norway's first independent king in over 500 years after the country peacefully separated from Sweden in 1905. Elected by popular vote in a constitutional monarchy experiment that could have gone very wrong, he immediately became a symbol of national unity. A foreign prince turned domestic monarch, he won over the public with humility, dignity, and a remarkable ability to make people believe in something larger than politics. And he believed in it too, perhaps too much. Behind his calm exterior was a man quietly shouldering the impossible. In private, friends and confidants would speak of his nervous energy, his long silences, and his increasingly familiar evening rituals. The drink of choice? Brandy or whiskey, sometimes both. Never in public excess, always within the ritual. Håkon didn't drink to forget or to celebrate. He drank to steady the nerves. And what nerves they were. The great test of Håkon's reign came in 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded Norway. Most European monarchs fled in the face of Hitler's blitzkrieg. Håkon didn't refuse to abdicate, refused to capitulate, and in doing so, became the living embodiment of national resistance. He went into exile in London, but refused to give up the crown. Norwegian broadcasts carried his speeches across enemy lines, and his silhouette became a quiet act of defiance against fascism. To the world, he was calm, composed, and brave. Behind the scenes, it was brandy with dinner, whiskey before bed. War wears on a man, especially one who must project unwavering resolve while watching his country burn from afar. Håkon aged during the war visibly. His beard grew grayer, his frame thinner. He spent nights pacing, rereading letters from home, standing at the radio, and always, somewhere nearby, a glass. This wasn't addiction in the way tabloids love to describe. It was something more subtle, more tragic. The daily ritual of a man alone in a palace, listening to the world fall apart, trying to keep himself from unraveling. When the war ended in 1945, Håkon returned to Norway a hero. People wept in the streets, crowds chanted his name, children waved flags, but something in him remained distant. The king had come home, but part of him never left that dim flat in London with its rationed meals and long, anxious nights. The brandy stayed. His later years were marked by declining health. He suffered a fall in 1955 that left him increasingly immobile. He began appearing in public less often. Audiences grew shorter, speeches slower. Doctors noted fatigue, blood pressure fluctuations, and bouts of insomnia. They prescribed rest. They avoided commenting on his evening drinks, which were still delivered quietly, without fanfare on a silver tray. Courtiers didn't speak of it openly. Norwegian royalty operated in a cultural silence, different from the tabloid-fueled courts of Britain or France. But servants spoke in hushed tones about the regularity of it. The same drink, at the same hour, a comforting presence, a private habit in a very public life. He died in 1957 at the age of 85, after nearly 52 years on the throne. The country mourned deeply. Newspapers carried tributes calling him the father of the nation, and for once the phrase didn't feel like hyperbole. Håkon had been a constitutional king, a wartime symbol, a moral compass, but also silently a man who needed a little help to hold all that weight. In many ways, Håkon's drinking was unremarkable. He didn't collapse. He didn't disgrace the crown. He simply sipped his way through one of the hardest jobs in history with as much grace as he could muster. But that's what makes his story so revealing. Because royalty doesn't always fall apart in scandal. Sometimes it just leans quietly on a glass and carries on. And yet, quiet endurance has its limits. Because not every monarch handles pressure with restraint. Some buckle, some withdraw, and some, like our next entry, lean so far into decadence they forget there was ever a throne to begin with. His name was Shah Sultan Hussein of Safavid Persia, and his empire would eventually slip through his fingers one long, wine-soaked banquet at a time. Shah Sultan Hussein, Safavid Persia. The fall of an empire rarely comes with a toast. But in the case of Shah Sultan Hussein, the last effective ruler of the Safavid dynasty in Persia, the decline came with full ceremonial glassware, a room full of courtiers, and a steady stream of wine that never seemed to run dry even as his empire did. Shah Sultan Hussein came to the throne in 1694, not through ambition, but through inheritance. He wasn't supposed to be king, not really. He had been groomed for a life of religious study, not governance. And by all accounts, he would have been happier in a theological seminary than in a palace. Unfortunately for him and for Persia, history had other plans. The crown landed on his head like a curse disguised in silk, and he never quite knew what to do with it. So, he drank. Not immediately, of course. At first, Sultan Hussein tried to govern in the way he'd been taught, passively, piously, and without too much personal involvement. He left administration to his court officials, deferred big decisions to clerics, and avoided conflict wherever possible. But empires are not passive things. They demand direction, especially ones as fragile and complex as late Safavid Persia, surrounded by enemies, plagued by internal divisions, and increasingly unable to support the weight of its own rituals. With each crisis, Hussein receded further, and with each retreat, the bottle came closer. Unlike some monarchs whose drinking was public spectacle or private shame, Sultan Hussein's indulgence was more systematic. It was built into the rhythm of his court. The wine flowed during feasts, yes, but also during late-night conversations with advisors, during strategy meetings that went nowhere, and during idle hours when there was nothing left to distract him from the realization that no one really respected his rule. He preferred red wine, Persian-made, sweetened with honey and spices. Court records mention banquets that lasted well into the night, with musicians playing softly in the background and the Shah half reclining on cushions, glass in hand, nodding absently to ministers who knew better than to expect clear answers. His court became a theatre of etiquette, everyone performing their roles, everyone avoiding the obvious, that the empire was drifting, and the man meant to lead it was comfortably adrift. Religious conservatives at court were appalled. Persia had long balanced its Islamic identity with a Persian cultural heritage that included music, poetry, and yes, alcohol. But Sultan Hussein tilted the balance dangerously, not because he drank many Shahs had, but because he seemed to drink as a way of avoiding everything else. When Afghan tribal leaders began challenging Persian authority in the east, Hussein hesitated. He sent mixed messages. Then he sent none at all. Reports came in about unrest, but instead of mobilizing his forces, he hosted a festival with wine. Always with wine. He became increasingly reliant on the inner circle of courtiers and eunuchs who fed him only the most flattering updates. Ministers who brought bad news were dismissed. Those who smiled, poured, and reassured him that Persia's enemies were merely disorganized rebels were promoted. It's not that he didn't care. It's that caring seemed futile. The more chaos piled up, the more he leaned on ritual, ceremony, and intoxication to smooth over the cracks. The cracks, of course, didn't care. By the time the Afghan leader Mahmud Hotak laid siege to Isfahan in 1722, the empire was already spent. The capital's defenses were poorly organized. The army was underpaid and demoralized. Supplies ran out. And inside the city, Sultan Hussein, still the symbolic heart of it all, continued to hold court, drink his wine, and wait for a miracle that never came. After 6 months of siege, starvation, and disease, Hussein surrendered, not with a battle cry, but with a soft-spoken abdication and a final ceremonial dinner. Mahmud Hotak entered the city to find a king too tired to fight and too intoxicated to care. Hussein handed over the crown, not in defiance, but in resignation, as if to say, let someone else deal with this. He lived for another decade, held under house arrest, occasionally brought out for ceremonial appearances by his captors. Even in captivity, it's said that he was offered wine, a habit too ingrained to break, even as the empire that once produced it lay in ruins. Sultan Hussein's story is not one of wild madness or flamboyant excess. It's the story of an empire undone by quiet inertia, and a monarch who drank not out of rebellion, but out of helplessness. His intoxication was not rebellion against power, it was an escape from it. And escape, as always, is temporary. But speaking of royal escapes, our next figure took the concept literally. A prince from Britain, often overlooked, frequently intoxicated, and perpetually fleeing from the constraints of both public life and royal expectation. His name was Prince Albert Victor, and his favourite hiding place was the bottom of a glass. Prince Albert Victor, United Kingdom. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was born to be king, technically. He was the eldest son of the future King Edward VII and the grandson of Queen Victoria, placing him second in line to the throne of the British Empire at its imperial zenith. But if history is a river, Albert Victor wasn't so much rowing upstream as floating sideways, buoyed by privilege, distracted by pleasure, and perpetually just a little too drunk to notice the current pulling him under. To the public, he was a royal mystery. Not scandalous enough to be infamous, not accomplished enough to be admired. Always hovering at the edge of importance, like a chandelier in a room no one wanted to sit in. But to those who knew him or encountered him across a marble bar in a London gentleman's club, Albert Victor was more of a cautionary tale than a crown in waiting. Born in 1864, he was groomed for leadership in theory, but not so much in practice. His education was polite, superficial, and carefully curated to avoid stress. Tutors noted his gentle nature, his love of art and fashion, and his inability to focus for more than a few minutes at a time. Absent-minded, they called him. Sensitive, said the newspapers. Unfit, whispered the aristocracy. And behind it all, silently, inevitably, there was alcohol. London in the late Victorian era was a city of dualities, grandiosity and grime, empire and inequality, civility and vice. Prince Albert Victor, also known as Eddie to his family, preferred the latter half of each pair. He was frequently seen in the more fashionable parts of town, private clubs, elite parties, and the kinds of drawing rooms where the whiskey flowed faster than the conversation. These weren't the official engagements where one practiced statecraft. They were social arenas where one practiced forgetting. Eddie drank like someone who'd already decided he wouldn't live long enough for consequences to matter. Brandy before dinner, port with dessert, champagne when appropriate, and when inappropriate. One footman once remarked that the prince preferred a breakfast of silence and scotch, a comment that was equal parts admiration and concern. By his mid-20s, his face had taken on the soft, flushed look of someone constantly negotiating with hangovers. But he wasn't wild, not in the Peter the Great sense. His drinking didn't fuel public outbursts or political theatrics. It fueled withdrawal. If anything, alcohol made him quieter, slower. He'd attend social events and sit with a dazed smile, nodding at conversations he wasn't following, drifting off mid-sentence. He rarely initiated anything. He let things happen to him, like a man watching his own biography from a distant balcony. Rumors, of course, followed. Some whispered that his frequent disappearances into London's nightlife scene were to cover deeper scandals. Others suggested he was being protected from himself by the palace shielded from scrutiny, cocooned in protocol. But whether the rumors were true or exaggerated, one detail was consistent. Prince Albert Victor was nearly always drinking. During his brief time in the British Army, the issue persisted. Officers noted his lack of discipline, his disinterest in command, and his tendency to disappear on unsanctioned leaves of absence, most of which, unsurprisingly, led to establishments with extensive wine lists and short memories. The military didn't discipline him. They couldn't err. He was, after all, the heir to the heir. You don't court-martial the monarchy. You just write quieter reports. By the late 1882nd, Eddie's health was in decline. He suffered from frequent colds, persistent fatigue, and what his doctors euphemistically called nervous exhaustion. In reality, it was a cocktail of physical fragility, emotional detachment, and years of slow, steady self-sedation. The brandy wasn't medicine, but it did a convincing impression. In 1891, he became engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, a move the palace hoped would stabilize him. It didn't. Just a few weeks later, Albert Victor contracted influenza during a pandemic sweeping through England. His already weak constitution couldn't handle it. He died in January 1892, at the age of 28. In a quiet room, far from the clubs, far from the headlines, far from the throne he would never reach. His death shocked the country, but not the inner circle. The public wept for the lost prince. The court breathed a silent sigh of relief, because the truth was, Albert Victor wasn't just unfit to be king, he was unfit to be himself. Too soft for the crown, too numb to rebel, and too intoxicated to find a way out. And yet, compared to the chaos that came next, Eddie's quiet decay almost seems quaint. Because our next royal didn't just drink behind closed doors, he performed in front of thousands, in costume, with a goblet in one hand and a burning city behind him. His name was Nero, and he preferred his wine served with fire. Emperor Nero, ancient Rome. If you could distill unhinged theatricality into a human being and then soak it in wine, you'd have Nero, Rome's most infamous emperor, and arguably its most dramatic. Born into the twisted lineage of the Julio-Claudians, Nero came to the throne at age 16, inherited a capital teetering on paranoia, and somehow decided the best solution was to burnish his legacy with wine-drenched performances and the kind of excess that made even the Roman Senate blush. It's not that Nero drank, it's how he drank, like a playwright writing his own death scene. Like Bacchus himself had descended into human form, gotten bored of being worshipped, and decided to stage an opera instead. The young emperor was, at first, promising. Guided by Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, and Burrus, the capable Praetorian prefect, Nero appeared reasonable, modest, even affable. But moderation didn't suit him. It wasn't long before his tutors lost influence, and Nero began to lean more into his passions: music, theatre, luxury, and alcohol, which fueled them all. Wine in ancient Rome wasn't the accessory to power, it was power. Every social event, feast, and political maneuver happened under the influence of vintage Falernian or some other imported nectar. But Nero didn't just attend the banquets, he became the banquet. It was said that he threw nightly orgies of food, drink, poetry, and music. One guest described it as an avalanche of indulgence with no beginning or end. There were fountains that flowed with wine, servants who poured goblets before a hand was even raised, musicians on standby for impromptu performances. Nero, never shy, often provided the entertainment himself. He would sing or attempt to in a slurred tone somewhere between tragic hero and drunk karaoke champion. No one dared criticize him. Applause was mandatory. The man was the state. There's the infamous story of the emperor dressing as a slave and wandering the streets at night, drunkenly assaulting unsuspecting citizens, a fact that even Roman historians couldn't write without blinking. When those citizens began arming themselves in self-defense, Nero reportedly sulked and increased his private guard. But he didn't stop the nightly outings, he just did them drunker. And then, of course, there was the fire. In 64 AD, a massive blaze engulfed Rome. The city burned for 6 days. The public panicked. The Senate scrambled. Nero? According to legend, he stood on a balcony, watching the flames, playing a lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. Was it true? Probably not exactly. But it says a lot that everyone believed it could have been, because Nero was that guy, the one who might genuinely pair urban destruction with a vintage red and an original ballad. In the aftermath, he blamed Christians, had many of them arrested, and threw elaborate spectacles in which they were tortured and executed, all while he reclined in silk robes, wine in hand, basking in the performance of his own cruelty. His reality was theatre, and wine helped keep the lines blurry. As paranoia grew, so did his dependence. He began seeing plots everywhere in the Senate, in the army, in his own family. He had his own mother murdered, friends exiled or executed. The wine, by then, was less indulgence and more insulation. His decision-making grew erratic. He'd shift from generosity to bloodshed with no warning. He once ordered a massive golden house built in the heart of the ruined city, the Domus Aurea, complete with rotating banquet halls and lakes of imported fish, all fueled by a daily flood of wine. Eventually, even the Roman elite couldn't take it. Revolts broke out. The army deserted him, and in 68 AD, as forces closed in, Nero fled. Still grand in his delusion, he declared that he would die a great artist. He didn't. He was abandoned, confused, and one imagines drunk. When he died, the empire breathed. And history began writing the myth of a man who mistook power for performance and mistook wine for wisdom. And if Nero was performance, our next royal was pure appetite. Less poetry, more poultry. Less theatre, more table. His name? Henry VIII. And he didn't just drink. He feasted like a nation couldn't fall apart under the weight of a banquet hall. King Henry VIII, England. To say Henry VIII liked his food and drink is like saying the Atlantic Ocean is slightly damp. The man didn't dine. He devoured. He didn't drink. He conquered goblets the way he conquered monasteries with force, entitlement, and absolutely no regard for long-term consequences. Born in 1491, Henry was not supposed to be king. That honour belonged to his older brother, Arthur. But when Arthur died young, Henry, then a bright, athletic, affable teenager, found himself heir to the throne of England. The early years of his reign were full of promise. He was charming, educated, idealistic, fit. But somewhere between the wives, the wars, and the split with the Catholic Church, Henry transformed from golden prince to bloated monarch, dragging a body swollen with gout, a soul hardened by paranoia, and a goblet that rarely left his hand. Alcohol was as embedded in Tudor life as Latin was in the Mass. Clean water was risky, and ale was considered a breakfast drink. Wine was for the noble, and Henry, believing himself both noble and exceptional, consumed both in staggering quantities. His court was famous for its endless feasts, multi-day affairs where meat was the main course, side dish and garnish, swan, peacock, venison, boar. Everything roasted, glazed, stuffed, and then washed down with barrels of claret, Gascon red, and sack. Food historians have reconstructed Tudor diets from palace records, and the numbers read more like military logistics than menus. One week could see the consumption of over 1,000 gallons of wine, and that was just for the royal household. Henry drank to celebrate, to mourn, to show off, to intimidate. He toasted victories, treaties, births, and occasionally his own reflection. And his drinking wasn't theatrical like Nero's, it was gluttonous, a demonstration of power through consumption. His belly, swollen with food and fortified wine, became as much a symbol of royal might as his scepter. When foreign ambassadors met with him, they were treated to banquets so extravagant they sometimes had to be carried out. As he aged, the drinking intensified, his health deteriorated, his legs swelled, ulcerated, and pained him terribly. Physicians begged him to cut back. Henry responded by hiring more cooks. By the final years of his life, he was reportedly consuming up to 13 pints of strong ale per day, alongside his meals, which by then had become more symbolic than nutritional. He became suspicious, moody, isolated. The wine dulled the edges of his rage, but not the core. His decisions grew crueler, not louder, just more final. Cromwell, More, Anne. Names that once sat beside him at table now vanished from it entirely. He died in 1547, leaving behind a fractured country, a shattered church, and a historical legacy soaked in both blood and Bordeaux. His waistline had grown to over 54 inches. His body like his reign, had expanded beyond all natural limits. And yet, for all his indulgence, Henry was nothing if not effective if you measure success in terms of survival and lineage. But our next royal wasn't driven by power or gluttony. He was driven by desperation. King Richard III drank not to dominate, but to hold himself together one anxious sip at a time, with the kingdom slipping away. King Richard III, England. Richard III's drinking didn't come with spectacle. It came with tension. Where Nero held a lyre and Henry VIII wielded a turkey leg, Richard III held a dagger and a cup of wine, eyes fixed on everyone in the room like they might vanish, or worse, speak. His was a reign built on paranoia, and like so many rulers who came to power by questionable means, Richard didn't just drink for pleasure, he drank for nerves, to dull them, to feed them, and sometimes just to keep them from getting loud enough to notice what he had become. Born in 1452, Richard came into a world already ablaze. England was deep in the Wars of the Roses, the dynastic blood feud between the houses of York and Lancaster. By the time Richard reached adulthood, he'd lost a father in battle, seen a brother rise to the throne, and watched England change monarchs the way other countries changed weather. He was sharp, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to his family until loyalty became inconvenient. In 1483, when his brother Edward IV died suddenly, Richard was named Lord Protector for his 2-year-old nephew, the new king, Edward V. But within months, Edward V was declared illegitimate, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and never seen again. And Richard, crowned king. It's still debated what really happened to the princes in the Tower, but Richard's contemporaries didn't wait for a verdict. The whispers grew, the smiles shrank, the goblets filled faster. Unlike some monarchs, Richard III didn't use alcohol as a tool for celebration or charm. He drank quietly, often late into the night, surrounded by loyalists who spoke carefully and looked over their shoulders. His drinking wasn't reckless. It was controlled until it wasn't. The stress of ruling a fractured kingdom, with enemies both foreign and domestic, took a visible toll. Chroniclers mention how his temper grew shorter, his decisions more reactionary, his hours more unpredictable. He would spend entire evenings in strategy meetings that spiraled into sullen silences and clinking glasses. Wine was the standard fare of English nobility at the time, and Richard preferred it in its strong, imported varieties, Gascon red or Rhenish white, delivered by the barrel and measured not in quality but in effect. It wasn't about taste, it was about armor, the kind you wear inside. He needed it. His reign lasted barely 2 years, but every month of it felt like a siege. Rebellion sparked, loyalties shifted, propaganda spread like wildfire. His enemies painted him as a tyrant, a usurper, a murderer with a hunched back and a heart as crooked as his spine. Whether those accusations were fair or political theatre hardly mattered. Richard knew he was losing the story, and he drank accordingly. By the time he faced Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard was desperate. He knew the odds, knew the loyalty of his nobles was thin, knew that England didn't need another king with a dagger behind his back and a wine cup at his lips, but still he fought. The last English king to die in battle, Richard met his end not at a banquet or in bed, but on a muddy field, swinging a sword, charging headlong into the future that would not include him. His death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudors. It also ended one of the most tension-filled, anxiety-ridden reigns in English history. And while Shakespeare would later dramatize Richard into a monstrous caricature slathering on villainy and ambition like stage makeup, the real man, by most accounts, was more tragic than theatrical. A king who drank not for power or pleasure, but because his world was falling apart and no one else would hold it together for him. And speaking of appearances versus reality, our next royal wore a hero's image in public and poured his doubt into the bottom of a glass in private. He was strong, noble, and haunted not by scandal or war, but by quiet, internal fractures. King Albert I of Belgium, the man of marble on the outside, and something far softer beneath. King Albert I. To most Belgians, King Albert I was the lion of the trenches. The king who stood firm when his country was overrun in World War I, who walked among his soldiers, who refused to flee. Statues would later be built of him, cast in iron and marble, eyes forever fixed on the horizon, jaw set with resolve. But the thing about marble is that it doesn't bleed, and it certainly doesn't drink. The real Albert did both. Born in 1875, Albert I ascended the throne in 1909. Belgium was a young nation, precariously balanced between European giants and held together more by hope than history. Albert took his role seriously. He was a constitutional monarch, limited in official power but unlimited in symbolic weight. And when Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, violating its neutrality, Albert didn't hide. He led. He was celebrated internationally, called the Soldier King. Lauded for his dignity, respected even by his enemies. But what history forgets is that being a symbol is exhausting. And when you're the embodiment of a nation under siege, every gesture, every word, every misstep matters. So, Albert rarely allowed himself to misstep in public. He rode horses, gave speeches, wrote letters to soldiers in the trenches. But in private, especially during the long, uncertain years of war, he began to drink, quietly, regularly, not out of recklessness, but out of grief. Whiskey was his drink of choice. Neat, unmixed. He would sip slowly, staring into the fire, as if waiting for something to rise out of it. A solution, a victory, or maybe just sleep. Sleep, after all, had grown difficult. He lost friends during the war, watched cities burn, read intelligence reports about atrocities, made impossible decisions how long to hold the line, how many civilians to evacuate, how many soldiers to send into battles he knew they wouldn't survive. He carried all of it, with silence, with posture, with a brand of stoicism that looked noble from the outside and unbearable from the inside. Letters between Albert and his close confidants suggest a man deeply empathetic and increasingly fatigued. He would write late into the night, often with a drink beside him, confessing how difficult it was to remain calm when the world was cracking. He didn't scream, he didn't flail. He drank just enough to dull the sharpest edges of reality. After the war, Belgium celebrated him as a hero. He returned to cheering crowds, medals, ovations, but Albert never fully re-entered civilian life. His body returned from the war, but part of his mind stayed behind in the mud and fog. He became more isolated, more reflective. He still performed the royal duties, still appeared at state functions, but friends noted that he grew quieter, more inward. He died in 1934. During a solitary mountain climb in the Ardennes. The official story is simple. He slipped, fell to his death. Tragic, but noble. But some who knew him said the climb was his escape, a place without speeches, without expectations, without the constant weight of history. His whiskey flask was reportedly found near the site, empty. There was no scandal, no disgrace. Just a man who had held together a nation and held himself together with just enough strength and just enough drink to make it to the other side of war. But not much further. And now we move from the cold mountains of Belgium to the tropical stillness of a Southeast Asian palace, where our next king found his throne too heavy, his days too quiet, and his nights far too long. His name was King Sisowath Monivong of Cambodia, and by the end, he wasn't ruling his kingdom. He was drinking to forget it. King Sisowath Monivong, Cambodia. Some monarchs decline with fireworks, others with shadows. King Sisowath Monivong of Cambodia belonged firmly to the latter. He didn't plunge his kingdom into chaos. He didn't throw scandalous parties. And he certainly didn't issue proclamations while inebriated in public. Instead, he ruled quietly, cautiously, and drank even more quietly, with a kind of resigned dignity that felt less like indulgence and more like retreat. Born in 1875, Monivong was a product of colonial complexity. Cambodia, during his lifetime, was a nominal kingdom, an autonomous puppet wrapped in French colonial red tape. Real power rested with colonial administrators in Phnom Penh and Paris. The monarchy existed more for show than for sovereignty. By the time Monivong became king in 1927, at the age of 52, the throne he inherited was ornate but hollow. So he did what many leaders have done when authority is limited and frustration is infinite. He kept the rituals going, played his role, and began to lean into whatever personal comforts he could afford. His was a life of quiet indulgence, the kind often mistaken for serenity. He maintained the appearance of Buddhist piety and royal grace, all while spending long hours in private seclusion, often in the company of imported French wines, Cambodian rice spirits, and trusted companions who knew not to ask questions. For Monivong, drinking wasn't rebellion. It was ritual. A soft refusal. A silent protest against a political system in which he was expected to act like a king without being allowed to rule like one. He lived through war, colonization, and the erosion of tradition. He saw his country's sacred institutions turned into decorative museum pieces for French tourists. He watched Buddhist monks reduced to photo ops, royal processions timed to fit colonial schedules. It wore him down, not all at once, but year by year, sip by sip. Palace staff described a king who often rose late, took his breakfast slowly, sometimes accompanied by a small glass of rice, wine, and conducted state business only when absolutely required. He preferred to stay at his summer retreat in Bokor, a colonial hill station known for its cooler climate and haunting, mist-covered isolation. It was a palace in the clouds, perched high above the world, and it was there that Monivong spent much of his final years drifting between small ceremonial duties and long, contemplative evenings. Alcohol was ever present, not in the form of loud banquets or elaborate drinking rituals, but as a soft companion. Glasses appeared and disappeared like props in a well-rehearsed play. It wasn't about excess, it was about escape. In his final years, Monivong became increasingly detached. Colonial reports noted his reluctance to engage in modern reforms or political dialogue. Some saw him as weak, others as tired. In truth, he was probably both. Tired of pretending his throne still meant something. Tired of playing a king in a world that had forgotten how to believe in one. He died in 1941, not long after retreating again to Bokor Hill Station. His death was reported as natural old age, compounded by stress and illness. But those close to him hinted that his health had been deteriorating for years, quietly eroded by alcohol, inactivity, and disillusionment. His son, Norodom Sihanouk, would succeed him, chosen, interestingly, by the French, who believed the young prince would be easier to control. And so Monivong faded from history, remembered less for any single action than for the long, slow dissolution of a monarch who drank not for celebration, not for spectacle, but because he no longer recognized the world his crown was supposed to rule. But if Monivong's drinking was a slow surrender to irrelevance, our next royal embraced alcohol with theatrical flair even in exile. A French king who lost his throne but not his taste for wine, brandy, or, oddly enough, nostalgia. His name was Charles X, and wherever he went, the liquor followed. King Charles X. King Charles X, the last king of the Bourbon Restoration, didn't go out with a revolution. He went out with a toast. Charles X, the younger brother of Louis XVI, he of guillotine fame, and Louis XVIII, he of careful silence, was the final gasp of pre-revolutionary French monarchy, a man hopelessly addicted to the idea of divine right and increasingly, in his later years, quietly addicted to alcohol. Born in 1757, Charles lived through everything: the fall of the monarchy, the reign of terror, Napoleon, the Restoration, and another revolution. He returned to the throne in 1824, after decades in exile, as part of a fragile attempt to re-establish royal legitimacy in post-revolutionary France. It didn't work, not because Charles was evil or incompetent, but because he was out of touch and deeply uncomfortable in the modern world, a world that didn't bow easily anymore. From the beginning of his reign, Charles tried to rewind time. He reasserted the power of the church, compensated nobles who'd lost land during the revolution, and generally behaved as though 1789 had never happened. Unsurprisingly, the people, especially the growing liberal bourgeoisie, found this frustrating. And when frustration built, Charles found his own relief: brandy. His drinking habits weren't wildly scandalous. France, after all, has never been a nation to shame its leaders for a well-aged glass of cognac. But Charles was no connoisseur. He wasn't drinking to appreciate the notes of oaken fruit. He was drinking to retreat. In his youth, Charles had been a notorious libertine, hunting, parties, mistresses, and late-night escapades defined his years as Count of Artois. But as king, age caught up with him. The parties ended, the speeches slowed, and the drinking became less playful, more habitual. His evenings, particularly during the political unrest of the late 1822, were filled with long silences, candlelight, and the sound of decanters being quietly refilled. He didn't rant, he didn't rage, he simply drank and refused to change. In 1830, after pushing through repressive ordinances that restricted the press and dissolved the legislature, Charles sparked the July Revolution. Paris rose in 3 days. Barricades filled the street. And Charles, with all the grace of a man completely out of step with history, abdicated and left France again. Exile, however, did not improve his habits. He moved to Britain briefly, then Austria, finally settling in a quiet corner of the Habsburg Empire. There, stripped of power but not of memory, Charles fell into routine. Long walks, daily prayers, and increasingly long hours with a bottle. The brandy dulled the loneliness. The wine softened the humiliation. Those who visited him noted how often the conversation drifted first into reminiscences of Versailles, then into sighs, then into silence. The glasses on his desk were always full. The man in the chair never quite was. He died in 1836, quietly, in a rented house in Gorizia. No throne, no court, just a name, a title, and a cellar that never quite emptied. And so ended the Bourbon monarchy, bookended by revolution and gently drowned in cognac. But our next royal needed no throne to drown his legacy. He found his collapse not in France, but in a Belgian palace full of ghosts, secrets, and a king who ruled an empire he refused to visit and drank to forget. His name was Leopold II, and his conscience was as flooded as his glass. King Leopold II, Belgium. King Leopold II is remembered less as a monarch and more as a shadow, tall, cold, and stretching across a continent he barely set foot on. The public version was a dignified European sovereign with a famously luxuriant beard and a taste for architecture. The private version, something murkier. A man who micromanaged colonial atrocities from a safe distance while slowly slipping into a secluded, alcohol-steeped twilight of his own making. He ruled Belgium from 1865 to 1909, but much of his legacy lies far from Brussels in the Congo, where his personal colony bled under a regime of violence, forced labor, and silence. Officially, the Congo Free State was his humanitarian project. Unofficially, it was a private empire that funded his opulence and his isolation and, perhaps, his drinking. Because behind the palaces and the ribbon cuttings, Leopold drank. Not flamboyantly, not with the public flair of a Henry VIII or the tragic haze of a Charles II. His drinking was discreet, controlled, and methodical. Like everything else he did, he preferred wine French, expensive, aged, and rarely poured in public. But those close to the court noted his growing dependence on it in his later years. Not because he enjoyed the taste, but because it offered a narrow escape hatch from a growing pile of moral contradictions he had no intention of resolving. In private meetings, he sipped steadily. In his writing room, glasses disappeared faster than pages were written. Even in his correspondence, carefully preserved by the palace, the tone changes over time, from clinical calculation to something resembling exhaustion, and beneath it all, a slow, quiet drowning. He didn't talk about Congo over brandy. He talked about garden design, city planning, art, and monuments. Leopold was obsessed with legacy. He built public parks, museums, and towering public buildings in Belgium, as if he could scaffold his reputation with stone, but no amount of marble could silence what was happening in Africa. And the more criticism mounted, the more Leopold withdrew. By the early 1902, international outrage over the Congo Free State had grown deafening. Reports surfaced of mutilations, murders, mass exploitation. British and American journalists exposed what Belgian officials refused to acknowledge. Leopold, now in his 60s, responded not with speeches, but with distance. He stopped making public appearances, refused to answer questions, and in private, the wine cellar was opened a little more often. He moved from palace to palace, retreating into luxury, surrounded by sycophants and expensive distractions. Evening dinners became longer, wine lists grew thicker. Courtiers learned to judge his mood by the number of bottles opened before dessert. He wasn't entertaining guests, he was silencing noise. Eventually, under pressure, Leopold was forced to cede control of the Congo to the Belgian state. He did so bitterly, resentfully, and with the air of a man betrayed by the world. He never apologized, never admitted guilt. He continued to defend his actions in public silence and private defiance, while his nights grew hazier and his tone more morose. He died in 1909, just days before his country could pass laws cutting his remaining financial ties to the Congo. It was a poetic exit, narrowly escaping accountability one final time. The funeral was met with protest, crowds jeered, and history closed its eyes. But his wine glass stayed full to the end. If Leopold's drinking was a shield, quiet, elegant, and impenetrable, The next royal wore his alcohol like a cape, swaying down public avenues in a state of open inebriation, daring anyone to challenge him. He was not refined. He was not discreet. He was King Ernest Augustus I of Hanover, and he didn't hide his glass. He waved it. King Ernest Augustus I, Hano. If the British monarchy had an unruly cousin who refused to play by the rules, drank during state ceremonies, and made absolutely no attempt to pretend otherwise, it was King Ernest Augustus I of Hanover. He was the kind of royal who entered a room like a half-spilled bottle, loud, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Born in 1771 as the fifth son of King George III of Britain, Ernest Augustus was never supposed to wear a crown. But fate and the elaborate succession rules of the Kingdom of Hanover had other plans. When his older brothers died without legitimate heirs, he inherited the throne of Hanover in 1837, splitting off from Britain in a dynastic shuffle that made continental politics even messier than usual. Unlike his more reserved British relatives, Ernest wasn't interested in appearances. He was blunt, conservative, to the point of anachronism, and widely disliked. He hated constitutional reform, disliked criticism, and had a reputation for pettiness that verged on performance art. But more than anything, he had a reputation for drinking. Ernest Augustus didn't sip, he swilled. State functions were often laced with the smell of strong liquor. Guests would note how visibly drunk he appeared during important events, slurring, swaying, and often insisting on personally delivering toasts that devolved into rants. His speeches were long, his patience short, and his tolerance for sobriety non-existent. One diplomat described meeting him at court and being received with breath that would set a cask alight. Another recalled a ball at which the king stumbled onto the dance floor, glass in hand, and declared the waltz to be unconstitutional nonsense. No one knew what he meant, no one corrected him. He considered drinking a masculine virtue a sign of strength, confidence, and good humour. He openly mocked those who refused a glass. Ministers who tried to present reports during sober hours were often told to relax and return after dinner. Dinner, of course, began with wine and ended with brandy. In between, policy was occasionally discussed, but rarely remembered. Even court life became chaotic. Staff came and went. Appointments were given to friends from drinking circles. Protocol was inconsistent at best and non-existent at worst. One anecdote tells of a visiting German prince who brought a detailed treaty proposal, only to watch in horror as Ernest poured wine on it during a toast and declared, "Now it's binding by spirit and ink." He ruled Hanover for 14 years, not effectively, but stubbornly. His opposition to liberal reforms was legendary. He once shut down a university for being too noisy. He clashed with his own parliament so frequently that they eventually stopped inviting him to most sessions, though he would often appear anyway, glass in hand, to remind them who wears the crown. He died in 1851, unapologetic to the end. The people of Hanover mourned his passing with the complexity one reserves for an uncle who made every wedding complicated, frustration, fondness, and a sigh of relief. But even his critics had to admit, Ernest never faked it. He never tried to be anything he wasn't. He drank in public, ruled by gut, and lived like someone who understood the absurdity of monarchy and decided to outdrink it. And while Ernest staggered through his reign like a pub brawler in a royal sash, our next king would drink under palm trees, a ruler from Africa whose glass was always full, even as his court crumbled around him. King Mwanga II of Buganda was young, erratic, and frequently lost in liquor, a sovereign who watched his own kingdom slip away through the haze. King Mwanga II. Uganda. History remembers some kings as reformers, others as tyrants. Mwanga II of Buganda somehow managed to be both, and neither, depending on the day, the advisor, and the depth of the bottle he was staring into. Born in 1868 and crowned as the Kabaka King of Buganda at just 18, Mwanga inherited not only a throne but an existential crisis. His kingdom, nestled in what is now Uganda, stood at the crossroads of tradition and foreign intrusion. Missionaries were arriving. Colonial agents were circling. Arab traders, European explorers, Christian converts, all were claiming pieces of a cultural fabric that had held for generations. And at the center of it all stood a teenage king, unsure of his footing and increasingly dependent on alcohol to help him find it. Mwanga's drinking began early in his reign, likely as a form of self-medication. The pressure on a young monarch to assert authority over a divided court in the face of foreign manipulation and religious factionalism was immense. He was expected to embody centuries of Bugandan tradition while responding to a world changing at breakneck speed. Alcohol offered him relief and then control, or at least the illusion of it. In traditional Bugandan culture, alcohol was woven into royal ritual, often used in feasts, negotiations, and ceremonies. But Mwanga took it further. He didn't just drink in celebration. He drank to blur lines between friend and enemy, between loyalty and betrayal, between past and future. Courtiers began to whisper of erratic behavior. Important decisions were delayed or made impulsively. Long nights of drinking were followed by abrupt decrees and emotional outbursts. And yet, Mwanga wasn't entirely without vision. He resisted British and German colonial advances with surprising tenacity, especially in his early years. He understood the threat posed by missionaries and foreign soldiers, but instead of building long-term strategies, he made reactive choices, striking out one moment, retreating the next. His authority weakened, and internal divisions grew. The more uncertain his rule became, the more he drank. Wine, banana beer, palm liquor, whatever dulled the noise. He surrounded himself with flatterers, many of whom shared in his drinking habits, reinforcing a closed feedback loop of indulgence and poor decision-making. Meanwhile, missionaries and colonial agents took notes, literally. By 1888, Mwanga's reign had collapsed under its own contradictions. He was deposed by his own chiefs, who had grown tired of his unpredictable leadership and increasing dependence on foreign threats to maintain internal order. He fled, regrouped, and somehow returned to power 2 years later with the help of outside allies. But the second act of his reign was no more stable than the first. He became a pawn in the broader game of imperialism. The British, recognizing his symbolic value, reinstated him as a figurehead under the guise of local autonomy. Mwanga, still drinking, still trying to claw back his authority, found himself trapped in a ceremonial loop. The title remained, the power did not. Frustrated and powerless, he once again turned to rebellion, this time against the British themselves. It was a bold move, but poorly executed. Underprepared and overestimated, his final revolt failed. He was captured and exiled to the Seychelles in 1899. There, in exile, the pattern repeated. He drank, a lot. Observers noted that he seemed haunted, often sitting for hours in silence, nursing cups of palm wine or imported spirits, staring out at the sea. It wasn't just homesickness. It was the slow realization that he had ruled and lost in a world that had been slipping away from him since the day he wore the crown. He died in 1903, aged just 35. Not in battle, not in a palace, but in obscurity, surrounded by waves, regrets, and whatever remained in the bottle. Today, Mwanga is remembered in Uganda with a mixture of controversy and sympathy. Some view him as a tragic figure, a young ruler caught in the chaos of colonial collision, left with little guidance and even less power. Others see him as unstable, a man who squandered the last independent days of his kingdom on intoxication and indecision. But both perspectives recognize the same truth, that Mwanga drank not for joy, but for armor and found it never quite enough. And yet, compared to the restrained culture of Japan, where emperors were expected to exist as distant symbols of celestial order, our next royal's drinking was quieter, more poetic, and equally baffling. Because Emperor Go-Toba didn't rage. He composed poems. And sometimes he composed them after a few too many cups of sake. Emperor Go-Toba, Japan. In Japan, where courtly behavior was ritualized to the point of stillness and rulers were expected to embody divine detachment, Emperor Go-Toba stood out not because he defied these expectations openly, but because he seemed to quietly forget them every time someone poured him a drink. Born in 1180, Go-Toba became emperor as a child during the final years of the Heian period. His accession was less a crowning and more a coronation of convenience. One of several child emperors shuffled through the throne by Japan's true power brokers, the Fujiwara regents, and later the emerging military class. He abdicated young, as many emperors did, but didn't disappear into monastic life or the passive ceremonial role expected of cloistered monarchs. He wrote poetry, practiced swordsmithing, staged rebellions, and drank. Not excessively, not destructively, but conspicuously. In a culture where court decorum placed a premium on subtlety and restraint, Go-Toba's habits were noticeable. He had a well-known fondness for Japan's traditional rice wine, which was both a social and sacred beverage. It featured heavily in festivals and rituals. But Go-Toba didn't limit his consumption to holidays or formal events. He reportedly enjoyed sake during long nights of poetry writing, in leisurely walks through the palace gardens, and even in moments of personal grief and national tension. Those close to him recorded stories of sake-fueled discussions where he would recite long, melancholy verses to small gatherings of artists and scholars. The lines were beautiful, haunting, and increasingly slurred as the night wore on. He was, by all accounts, a romantic. The kind of man who could appreciate the impermanence of cherry blossoms while slightly tipsy, and then write a 31-syllable waka about how their falling petals mirrored his own political disappointment. But underneath the poet's charm was a frustrated sovereign. Though nominally an emperor, Go-Toba held little real power. The rise of the Kamakura shogunate had reduced the imperial court to a symbolic ornament, and Go-Toba did not take it well. He attempted to reassert his authority, organizing the ill-fated Joku War in 1221, an open rebellion against the shogunate. It failed, spectacularly. After the rebellion, the shogunate exiled him to the Oki Islands, remote, windswept, and far from the fragrant incense of Kyoto's palaces. He would never return. And it was there, in exile, that his drinking became less of an eccentricity and more of a comfort. Contemporary accounts describe Go-Toba's years in exile as deeply reflective, often solitary, and punctuated by bouts of heavy sake drinking. He continued to compose poetry. Some of his most famous works came from this period, and he never stopped trying to shape his legacy. But those who encountered him spoke of a former emperor who would sit for hours in the same spot, gazing out at the sea, sipping quietly, as if waiting for history to remember him properly. He died in exile in 1239, after nearly 2 decades of displacement. By then, the court had largely moved on. The shogunate solidified its power. The emperor's role became more decorative than ever. And yet, Go-Toba left behind a strange legacy. A failed rebel, a forgotten monarch, a passionate poet, and a man who drank not to forget, but to remember how much he had once hoped to change. But while Go-Toba's sake fueled poetry and quiet reflection, our next royal's drinking was neither contemplative nor creative. It was disorder, it was instability, and it came wrapped in silk robes and formal titles held up by advisors and barely coherent. King Christian VII of Denmark wasn't just a ruler who drank. He was a ruler who ceased to exist outside of his glass. King Christian VII, Denmark. If the Danish monarchy ever resembled a puppet show, Christian VII was the limp figure dangling from the strings, formerly king, technically in power but drifting in and out of control with the help of alcohol, mental instability, and a palace full of people whispering on his behalf. Born in 1749, Christian VII ascended the throne at the tender age of 17, inheriting a wealthy, relatively stable kingdom. On paper, things looked promising. A well-educated prince with a prestigious lineage and a nation that wasn't currently at war. But within the palace walls, trouble had already taken root. From childhood, Christian displayed erratic behavior, mood swings, violent outbursts, and a disconnection from reality that would only grow worse with time. And from adolescence onward, he developed a strong dependence on alcohol, a companion that both fueled and numbed his inner chaos. Early chroniclers tried to play it down. Sensitive, they said. Unfocused. But behind the royal curtains, the signs were hard to ignore. By the time he was crowned, Christian was already drinking heavily ale, schnapps, wine, and imported brandies, often starting before breakfast, continuing through formal dinners, and ending with long, erratic walks through the palace corridors late at night. Alone, or with a few unlucky attendants, he would mutter to himself, gesturing wildly, cup in hand. His courtiers, unsure how to manage him, opted for containment. His ministers quietly took over state affairs, smiling through his rants, adjusting policy while pretending to take notes on whatever half-drunken decree he'd just issued. Everyone knew who held real power. Johann Friedrich Struensee, the royal physician turned de facto regent, who became the man behind the curtain during Christian's most disoriented years. Struensee attempted a series of Enlightenment-inspired reforms, all in the king's name, abolishing torture, modernizing the bureaucracy, curbing censorship, but none of it came from Christian himself. The king, lost in a fog of liquor and psychological collapse, simply nodded, or didn't. Occasionally, he'd shout something during a meeting and then laugh, oblivious to whether anyone had understood. At court functions, Christian's condition was painfully obvious. He would drink excessively, burst into inappropriate laughter, and behave erratically, sometimes vanishing from his own banquets, only to be found later in a guest's chamber or wandering the palace garden barefoot. Diplomats began writing private letters home that read like polite horror stories. "The king," one wrote, "is present." His wife, Queen Caroline Matilda, was left to manage the impossible, an unstable husband, a palace of competing factions, and the rapidly growing influence of Struensee, who eventually became her lover. Christian, for his part, seemed alternately unaware and uninterested. He continued drinking, more and earlier in the day. At times, he appeared childlike, at others, terrifying. Servants walked on eggshells. Ministers wrote 2 versions of every policy, one for public reading, one for Christian's approval. Eventually, the arrangement collapsed. Struensee was arrested and executed in 1772 during a palace coup orchestrated by the conservative nobility and Christian stepmother. Queen Caroline Matilda was exiled. And Christian VII? He was allowed to keep the crown but not the power. From that point forward, he was king in name only. His drinking continued, even as his world shrank. He became increasingly reclusive, appearing at state events only when absolutely necessary, and even then, often under heavy supervision. There were reports of him mumbling through official ceremonies, sipping from a flask hidden beneath his robes, eyes blank, smile crooked. He lived like this for decades, technically reigning, practically imprisoned by his own condition and the palace machinery built to contain it. When he died in 1808, Denmark had already moved on to his son, Frederick VI, who had ruled as regent for years. Christian VII remains one of the most tragic figures in royal history, not for what he did, but for what was done around him while he drifted in and out of coherence, guided by others and cushioned by the fog of alcohol. And yet, even he never tried to rewrite the world from his glass the way our next royal did. Because Catherine the Great wasn't just a ruler who drank. She was a ruler who could drink endlessly, strategically, and with a kind of imperial flair that turned vodka into a political instrument. Catherine the Great. Catherine II of Russia. Catherine the Great, if you prefer her PR version, was many things. Empress, reformer, writer, strategist, and, in certain circles, a known connoisseur of very strong drink. But don't confuse her with the many royals who drank to forget or fell apart under the influence. Catherine drank with intention, with timing, with a raised eyebrow and a full goblet held just so. Born a minor German princess in 1729, Catherine married into the Russian royal family, and after a series of increasingly chaotic events involving betrayal, palace coups, and a conveniently dead husband, emerged as Empress of all the Russias in 1762. She reigned for 34 years, during which she modernized Russian law, patronized the arts, expanded the empire, and deftly maneuvered through more political plots than most thriller novels would dare attempt. And through it all, vodka was never far from reach. Catherine understood the symbolic weight of everything. A glass of vodka raised in the company of nobles, solidarity. A toast in front of foreign diplomats, diplomacy. A night of heavy drinking following the exile of a court rival, message sent. She wielded alcohol the way others wielded swords. It was said she could outdrink most men at court, not in wild feasts or reckless debauchery, but with steely, calm endurance. Servants noted that her banquets were long, glittering affairs filled with rich food, ornate conversation, and plenty of spirits, vodka, of course, being the national staple, but also imported wines and brandies. Catherine sampled widely, but returned often to what she considered the drink of the Russian soul: clear, cold, undiluted vodka. She drank when she entertained visiting monarchs. She drank when reading dispatches from the front. And she certainly drank when writing her famously long and occasionally absurd correspondence with Enlightenment philosophers who, one suspects, had no idea she was composing half her letters with a slight buzz. But it wasn't just habit, it was armor. Despite her enormous power, Catherine was often surrounded by whisper campaigns, disloyal ministers, and the ticking clock of Russian tradition that never quite accepted her foreignness. She used drink the way she used wit, to disarm, to deflect, to obscure. If she drank heavily after the death of one of her lovers, she did so behind high palace walls. If she toasted to a victory, she did so with a court trained to pretend not to notice how many glasses she'd already had. And yet, her relationship with alcohol was not one of weakness. It was ritual, control, precision. That's what made it so different and so dangerous. As she aged, those close to her noted that her drinking increased during bouts of insomnia and political stress. She became more reclusive at times, more irritable. But the empire never faltered. Her mind stayed sharp, her letters stayed cutting, her policies stayed in motion. When she died in 1796, the empire she left behind was bigger, stronger, and more centralized than ever. And the vodka, still on the table, still poured into crystal, still remembered in legend. Catherine drank like a monarch who knew she'd already outlived every one of her enemies and saw no reason to go to bed thirsty. But our next royal would do none of that. He wasn't in command of his drinking. He was swallowed by it. From the heart of Africa, with a crown made of gold and a cellar filled with French wine, Emperor Bokassa, I would turn intoxication into delusion, and delusion into a failed empire dressed in velvet. Emperor Bokassa, 30 Central African Empire. In the long and storied catalogue of rulers who lost touch with reality, Jean Bedel Bokassa deserves his own gilded, wine-stained chapter. He wasn't born a monarch, he declared himself one. And he didn't inherit a crown, he made one, encrusted it with 80 carats of diamonds, and placed it on his own head while an orchestra played in a stadium that cost a third of his country's national budget. What else was there to drink after that but imported Bordeaux? Born in 1921-inch French Equatorial Africa, Bokassa rose through the ranks of the French colonial military before returning home to seize power in a coup in 1966. He named himself president, then president for life, and finally, in 1977, crowned himself emperor of the newly minted Central African Empire, a short-lived, extravagantly costumed detour from republic to paradis and back again. Bokassa didn't just drink, he drenched his rule in alcohol, theatricality, and delusion. Where other dictators built cults of personality with statues and slogans, Bokassa did it with banquet halls. With French chefs, crystal glasses, and enough imported wine to float the country's debt well beyond sea level. He had expensive tastes and zero shame about indulging them. French wine, champagne, cognac, all shipped to Bangui at public expense. When French journalists visited in the late 1972, they noted the palace cellars held vintages most Parisians had only seen in museums. At dinners, Bokassa would toast himself, lavishly, repeatedly. Aides reported that once the first glass was poured, policy talk was over. What followed was a surreal blend of rambling monologues, musical interludes, and sudden bursts of imperial decrees. Often contradictory, almost always forgotten by morning. Alcohol for Bokassa wasn't just a personal habit, it was part of the imperial aesthetic. His infamous coronation, which cost roughly $20 million, bankrupting the national treasury, was a performance designed to outshine Napoleon's eye. He even rode in a replica of Napoleon's coronation coach. The toasts flowed for hours. Courtiers, generals, and foreign dignitaries were expected to raise a glass every few minutes. A performance of loyalty as much as intoxication. A fog of excess settled over the palace. But beneath the showmanship was a ruler growing increasingly erratic, and dangerously so. His relationship with alcohol mirrored his grip on power, indulgent, unpredictable, and ultimately unsustainable. Reports from the time describe late-night meetings with slurred commands, early morning hangovers disguised as national silence, and long afternoons spent wandering the palace grounds with a glass in hand, inspecting troops that didn't exist and planning trips that never happened. Bokassa's court functioned more like a theatrical troupe than a government. Ministers were selected based on their ability to flatter, not govern, and alcohol was a required accessory. One former advisor recalled being forced to drink with the emperor at 10 a.m. not as a celebration, but as a loyalty test. Refusing the glass meant questioning the throne. Accepting it meant surviving another day. As criticism mounted abroad, Bokassa doubled down on theatrics and wine. When French diplomats began pulling away from the regime, he responded not with diplomacy, but with more banquets, more champagne, more toasts to his own greatness. But underneath it all, the foundation had cracked. By 1979, his delusions caught up with him. France, his longtime benefactor, finally lost patience. During one of Bokassa's overseas trips, French troops staged a bloodless coup, ending the empire and reinstalling the republic. The emperor returned to find his throne gone, his palace looted, and his cellar empty. He fled into exile, later returned, and was briefly imprisoned, but, in true surreal fashion, he lived long enough to see himself quietly pardoned and declared a pensioned-off former head of state. Not a hero, not a war criminal, just a bizarre footnote. Bokassa died in 1996, having spent his final years in a modest villa, sipping wine and occasionally giving interviews in which he referred to himself, without irony, as the last great emperor of Africa. And perhaps he was. Not great in legacy, but in spectacle, in ego, in audacity, and in drink. But from grand delusions, we move to imperial collapse, to the final monarch of a fading Southeast Asian dynasty, a king who drank not to dazzle, but to disappear. His name was Thibaw Min, and when he drank, it wasn't to rule. It was to mourn what was already gone. King Thibaw Min. Burma. There are few things more quietly tragic than a monarch who knows the game is over and keeps raising the glass anyway. Thibaw Min, the last king of Burma, now Myanmar, didn't start out a drinker. He started out a scholar, a devout Buddhist. A quiet, bookish young man raised in the golden splendor of the Mandalay Palace. But when he unexpectedly took the throne in 1878, the world he inherited was already trembling, and the bottle was already waiting. He was just 19 years old, an intellectual monk forced into kingship by palace factions looking for a pliable ruler. But Thibaw was not quite as passive as they hoped. Early in his reign, he oversaw a brutal purge of potential rivals, a move orchestrated largely by his ambitious queen and her powerful family. The violence haunted him. The consequences, both political and personal, drove him inward, and the alcohol began to appear more frequently by his side. The British Empire had long had its eyes on Burma, and Thibaw inherited a poisoned chalice. Negotiate with an aggressive colonial power or risk annihilation. Spoiler, he chose defiance, sort of. He made strong declarations of independence, but took few practical steps to prepare his kingdom militarily. Court life descended into paranoia, with long hours spent in seclusion and tension building between ministers who didn't trust each other or their increasingly withdrawn king. Diplomats reported that Thibaw would drink late into the night, sometimes alone, sometimes with close companions, waxing melancholic about the burden of power and the inevitability of foreign domination. When the British invaded in 1885, the entire Burmese kingdom collapsed in under 2 weeks. Thibaw, stunned and unprepared, surrendered without a fight. It wasn't courage that failed him, it was clarity. By then, his days were often blurred by wine and palm liquor, his nights given over to exhausted, fogged retreat. His signature on the surrender document was shaky, so was his posture. Exiled to India by the British, Thibaw spent the rest of his life in a kind of slow-motion disappearance. First to Madras, then to Ratnagiri, a quiet coastal town where he lived in an appointed villa, surrounded by a shrinking entourage and a growing collection of wine bottles. It was there that he began to drink more heavily, not to forget the fall of his empire, which he recounted constantly, but because it was the only thing left that he could control. He drank while dictating letters to British authorities demanding reinstatement. He drank while writing poetry about Mandalay. He drank while staring at the sea, which reminded him of nothing and no one. The palace silk was gone. The servants had left. Only the glass remained. Local observers in India noted how dignified he remained in public, reserved, quiet, almost regal. But privately, he was lonely, bitter, and deeply alcoholic. His daughters would later recall the emotional distance, the haunted gaze, the long silences punctuated by the soft sound of a glass being set down or filled again. Thibaut died in exile in 1916, a man who had once ruled the last great Theravada Buddhist monarchy in Southeast Asia, reduced to a forgotten tenant on colonial land. His body was buried in a local cemetery. His dynasty, his palace, his lineage erased. Today, in Myanmar, there are still whispers about his reign, about what might have been, about the final days of Mandalay, but mostly about a man who watched history collapse in real time and chose to meet it not with fire or fury, but with a raised cup and a distant gaze. From there, we travel to Italy, where the last king didn't just lose his throne. He drank through its final days, in elegant exile, clinging to old-world formality, while his country turned the page. His name was Umberto II, and by the end, even his toasts felt like farewells. King Umberto II, Italy. If Peter the Great drank like a warlord and Bokassa like an emperor of illusions, then King Umberto II drank like a gentleman standing at the door of history, waiting politely to be shown out. By the time Umberto II finally became King of Italy in 1946, the world had already moved on. His reign, if you can call it that, lasted just 34 days, the shortest in Italian history. But the decline of his throne had been in slow motion for decades, and the liquor cabinet had been quietly, methodically opened long before the crown was placed on his head. Umberto was born in 1904 into a monarchy already teetering under the weight of modernity. His father, Victor Emmanuel III, had ruled through 2 world wars, a fascist dictatorship, and a number of historical choices so staggeringly tone-deaf that by the time Umberto inherited the throne, the monarchy had become less of an institution and more of a national embarrassment in a tailored suit. Umberto was nothing if not image-conscious. Tall, well-groomed, always impeccably dressed, he projected an air of classic European royalty, stiff upper lip, perfect posture, a handshake like a contract. But behind the polished veneer, there was a man increasingly drowning in ceremonial irrelevance and private sorrow, and like many exiled kings before him, he turned to the glass not with a roar, but with a sigh. His drinking didn't begin with exile, but exile certainly gave it purpose. When Italy voted to abolish the monarchy in a referendum in June 1946, barely a month into his reign, Umberto fled the country with the kind of poise that made it look like a weekend trip rather than a permanent eviction. He settled in Cascais, a quiet coastal town in Portugal, in a villa that seemed stuck somewhere between nostalgia and resignation. And there, among faded tapestries, dusty heirlooms, and diplomatic photo albums no one cared about anymore, the bottle became more than a habit. It became routine. Wine at lunch, brandy at sunset, scotch before dinner, a nightcap of nostalgia. To be fair, Umberto didn't spiral. He didn't stage drunken outbursts or embarrass himself in public. He wasn't a spectacle. He was a man out of place, out of time, and painfully aware of it. His drinking was controlled, elegant even, but constant. Friends noticed. Diplomats who visited him would find him charming, well-spoken, and always one drink in. The ex-king would host small dinner parties in his villa. There would be toasts to old Italy, to lost friends, to forgotten battles. The wine was always good Italian when possible, though he had Portuguese favourites too. Guests often noted how quickly he pivoted from political discussion to wistful stories of childhood, of royal rituals, of the precise way his father had his morning coffee prepared. Then another glass. There was something deeply theatrical about Umberto's relationship to alcohol. He wasn't numbing himself, he was preserving himself, like a wax figure in a museum that never opened. He drank not to forget, but to freeze time. To hold it still, just long enough to remember what it once felt like to matter. In the 1952nd and 62nd, he made quiet attempts to restore his reputation. Letters to Italian officials, carefully worded interviews, a few televised appearances where he looked tired but stately. And always, the drink just off screen, just out of focus. There were no children playing in the villa, no royal court, just a handful of loyal retainers, visiting dignitaries, and the quiet hum of a radio playing news about a world that had left him behind. By the 1982nd, Umberto's health had declined. Not dramatically, just slowly, like a man wearing out the edges of his own myth. His liver had suffered, his memory flickered. But he still insisted on daily routines. A suit, a walk, a modest lunch, a glass of wine with the good crystal. He died in 1983 in Geneva, Switzerland, having never been allowed to return to Italy. The constitution forbade it, and Umberto, ever the formalist, never defied it. He was buried in Hautecombe Abbey in France, far from Rome, far from the monarchy, far from the people who voted him out before they even got to know him. In the end, Umberto II was less a king and more a postscript, a man who drank through the final chapter of a royal era, trying to hold on to a version of Europe that had already closed the book. And that's how it ends, not with a crash, or a revolution, or a scandal, but with a sigh, a toast, and a soft clink of glass in an empty room. 30 royals, 30 reigns, 30 ways to be crowned and uncrowned. Some drank to conquer, some drank to forget, a few drank to disappear, and others, like Umberto, drank to remember. But none of them, not one, could stop what was coming. And maybe that's the final mystery. Why do the people with the most power so often lose it at the bottom of a glass? Or maybe, just maybe, that was the plan all along.